What makes a story truly unforgettable? Is it the way it makes your blood run cold? The moment your mind tries to rationalize what your eyes are seeing? Or maybe it's that split second when you realize monsters are real. Welcome to The In-Between. I'm Carol Ann, and today is pretty special. Over these past months, we've shared hundreds of encounters, tales of dogmen and not deer, of soldiers facing the impossible, and ordinary people whose lives changed in extraordinary ways. But some stories just stay with you. Today, I'm sharing my personal favorites, the encounters that kept me up at night, the ones that made me question everything I thought I knew about our reality. These are the stories that gave me chills the first time I read them, and still give me chills today. So settle in, my curious friends. Lock your doors, check your windows, and maybe leave a light on. Because these aren't just any stories. These are the ones that haunt even me.
Walk like an Egyptian.
1987. A world of difference away.
Nobody puts baby in a corner.
From the world of today. For those of us who were in our teens in the 80s, most of us remember those days of relative freedom pretty fondly. Life was pretty easy and only getting better. Teenage girls spent most of their time learning how to put on makeup, hanging out at the mall, and swooning over Duran Duran. But if you were a boy with a bike at the beginning of summer, the world was your oyster. Matt and his friends, who were 14 at the time, had bikes. They would ride all around their hometown of Youngstown, Ohio, back in the days when the only rule most kids their age had was to be home by dark. But Matt and his friends had a favorite place that they liked to go. Partly because it was close to where one of their friends lived. Still took them a half an hour to run the gauntlet of highways and fences and gravel piles to get there, but mostly because it was a place where they could just hang out without anyone knowing where they were. Their own private hideout. Too bad this hideout happened to be inside one of the crumbling old buildings of the Jeannette blast furnaces of the Briar Hill Steel Company. The steel company and blast furnaces shut down in 1974, so after being abandoned for over a decade, nature had taken its toll on this place. Concrete floors were cracked and chipping, and the iron staircases were rusted and falling apart, and in some cases, only half there. Not to mention the occasional piece of falling concrete. There was no end to the list of ways these boys could get hurt by playing in this building. And that's only the danger of the building itself. That doesn't include the danger of the area the building is in. Packs of wild dogs roamed the area. These are not the friendly pups that need rescuing. These were the kind that would rather take your hand than the treat you had in it. Not to mention the crime. Youngstown, Ohio, in general, was known as Murder Town, USA, and that particular area was known for its mafia body dumps, occasional gang activity, and the occasional dead homeless person, either murdered or attacked by the wild dogs. But they couldn't give this place up. It was perfect. The first floor was a big open space that was kind of like an atrium that was open to all the floors above. Standing in the middle, you could look up and see each of the 3 floors above you, each with a half wall that allowed you to look back down to the first floor. I'm calling it an atrium, but it's not like it was this beautiful garden area. It was empty, just concrete everywhere with a massive 4 to 5 foot wide pillar at each corner to hold everything up. To keep out prying eyes, either canine or human, they had used these 3 to 4 foot tall metal Spartan shield looking pieces of metal that just happened happened to be laying everywhere and stacked them up in 2 rows to build a double layer steel wall about 7 to 8 feet tall around the atrium's edges, with a small gap that made kind of a doorway out onto this concrete apron. And even then, there's still another 8 feet of open air above that. And maybe this place wasn't much to look at, but it was their own private corner of the world, their bro HQ. One June evening, Matt and 3 other boys out of the group of friends who, for the sake of this story, we're going to call Pete, Doug, and Terry, are hanging out in front of a fire on the first floor. And they lit fires there all the time. The whole place is just open concrete, so it's not like anything's going to catch fire. There's plenty of pallets and other debris around to burn, and the Spartan shield walls were high enough so no one outside could see the flames. It gets to be around 9:30, 10 o'clock at night, full dark outside, and the boys have hit that point around the campfire where everyone has told all the stories that they have to tell and are now just kind of staring into the flames when they hear the wild dog pack coming. The sound puts them on alert. They weren't really worried about the dogs. All of the actual staircases that led into the building had disintegrated to the point where the boys had to jump up and kind of crawl their way in. So the dogs can't get in, but the boys are curious. So they all get up and step through that gap in the shield wall and out onto this concrete apron that kind of sticks out from the side of the building. Between the moonlight from above and the firelight from their big bonfire spilling out over their shield wall, they can make out the edges of this 15 to 20 foot high pile of coke in front of them. Now, coke is a distilled coal that's used for fuel in the steelmaking process, and there are these huge piles of it as far as the eye can see in either direction. So the boys are standing out on this concrete outcropping when they see the dogs, maybe 6 or 7 of them, come in front of the building, make a left, paying no attention to the boys, which is pretty unusual, cross over the railroad tracks that run next to the building, and run up and over the big coke pile that is right in front of the boys. Immediately, they can hear the sounds of a pretty good dogfight starting. But it's happening on the far side of the coke pile, so they can't see it. They can hear some pretty vicious barking and growling going on, but they just assume it's a Jets versus Sharks of the dog pack world kind of a turf war going on. Until they hear the growl. It's a very loud and very deep half growl, half roar that rises through the air on the other side of the pile, followed by yelps and cries of pain from the dogs. And if that wasn't enough to get their attention, the 2 dogs that come flying over the top of the pile sure do. And not flying like they were moving fast, flying like something has picked them up and tossed them feet to the sky flying. The first one to come over lands in the coke, gets up, and limps away, obviously not interested in going back for a second try. The second one to come over hits the coke with a thud, sending coke bits everywhere. This one has not fared as well as the first one, with a deep, bleeding gash on its side. A couple more come sailing over the top, followed by the rest of the pack on foot. They all form up again, and as a pack, get the hell out of Dodge. As the boys stand there watching them leave and wondering what exactly could do this to the dogs, Terry says, "Guys, what is that?" Everyone follows Terry's finger to the pile, where they see, crawling to the top of the pile on all 4s, is the biggest animal Matt has ever seen. It is a gigantic wolf-looking creature that is so big, Matt thinks it's gotta be fake. This thing is easily as big or bigger than a polar bear, which, standing on all 4s, is about 5 feet at its shoulder, which is as tall as I am. But it's not a bear. It's the opposite of a bear. It's not the lumbering mass of a polar bear. This thing is long and sleek and muscular. It climbs to the top of the pile and watches the pack of dogs as they run away. And like the winner of any good dog fight, it then lifts its leg and starts marking its territory. And the boys, who are already freaked out, to say the least, at the sheer size of this thing, watch in panicked fascination as the stream of urine hits the coke pile with such force that coke bits go flying. They can hear the sound of it hitting the rock. Matt realizes that whatever this thing is, it is bigger and stronger than anything they could have ever imagined. And he can tell that this thing is not just an animal, but it's also not human. It is something else. And Matt says seeing this thing is the first time he can remember feeling actual raw fear. Because he knows right now its mind is still on the dogs. But at some point, it's going to see them or smell them or hear them or something. And at that point, its attention is going to turn to them. As if reading Matt's mind, Terry starts to stumble backwards, hitting the makeshift shield wall, causing one of the heavy shields to scrape across the concrete. Matt watches his biggest fear materialize in a split second when the beast snaps its head in their direction. The boys freeze as its eyes instantly zero in on them with a fleeting look of surprise that quickly turns to what Matt perceives is a look of anger that they're there. Immediately, the boys see its amber-colored eyes glowing. And it's not eye shine. As Matt describes it, it's like this thing has its own internal power source. All the boys are mesmerized by that glow. They're only like 20-25 feet away from it, and the eyes are so big and the glow is so bright that they can see the black pupils separate from the glowing amber around it, and they can see intelligence. And they all just stand there, feet frozen in place as the monster eyes them, each one of them one at a time down the line. When it gets to Matt, he feels like that stare pierces right to his very core. And before he can wrangle his thoughts back to coherence, the beast stands up on two legs. And in that instant, Matt realizes monsters do exist. This thing is so big that it just can't be real. It has to be fake, right? Or this has to be a dream that he's going to wake up from. And curled up in his cozy bed, he's going to feel really silly for being so scared of a stupid dream, right? Right? But he's not waking up. He watches this thing stand up on two legs and rise to twice the height it was before. And he's still not waking up. He notices that overall it's shaped like a man, but it has dog-shaped legs with almost comically long arms that go down almost to its ankles. But it doesn't have paws at the end of its arms. It has hands like long, grotesque raccoon hands that end in sharp claws. Its fur is maybe an inch long all over, even on its tail, and actually looks like it's never spent a night outside in its life. And it's jet black. It's so black that it's blacker than the black of night behind it. But the moonlight and firelight combination is throwing enough light that it glints off the black fur just enough to see the contours of its muscles. And it is ripped. Enormous quads, huge biceps, a broad chest that Matt estimates at about 4 to 5 feet across. They can see every defined muscle on its body. If he wasn't so terrified, Matt would say this thing was beautiful. But he is drawn back to those shining eyes. That is until it growls again. They can all hear the menacing, low-pitched rumble coming from the monster and can feel it as well. It's like your insides are vibrating and your entire body is unstable. Why not? Lions and tigers use infrasound to stun their prey. Why wouldn't this thing do the same thing? Matt feels the infrasound waves pass through his entire chest and his knees begin to buckle under him, and he bends over a bit to catch his balance, and he's still not waking up. He looks over at his friends to see two of them completely bent over, one looking like he's gonna throw up, and one actually dry heaving. Matt feels like he's gonna pass out himself and thinks, what the hell is going on? Long before he can even begin to try to make sense of what is happening, the monster starts moving toward them. In the stunning distance it covers in just 2 strides, snaps all of the boys back to attention. Terry turns around and runs back into the building with the other 3 right on his heels. None of them are running very fast. Whatever that growl did to them is still wearing off, so they're kind of moving at a fast wobble to try to get somewhere else. And the first thing they see is the stairs. Too panicked to have any rational thinking skills working, they take the stairs to the 3rd floor, where they are now basically stuck. And Matt is still not waking up from this nightmare. There is a fire escape outside of the 3rd floor, but the section under the 3rd floor has long since rusted and fallen away, so the only direction is up to the roof. On the 4th floor, there's also access to the roof, but none of the floors have any alternate route out of the building. If they want out, they have to go back down to the 1st floor where that thing is. Terry starts losing his mind and starts crying and screaming, which, if the wolf thing doesn't already know where they are, certainly isn't going to help keep it that way. Alarm bells go off in Matt's head, who, running on pure adrenaline, grabs Terry so hard it lifts him off the floor. And he puts his hand over Terry's mouth, desperate to stop the noise. And even though his cries for help are now severely muffled, Terry keeps screaming through Matt's hand. Everyone else is shouting in the loudest whispers they dare, telling Terry, "You gotta shut up, man. Be quiet. It's gonna find us." Finally, Terry runs short on air and shoots Matt a pleading stare. Matt tells him, "If you promise to shut up, I'll let you go." When Terry nods, Matt loosens his grip, setting Terry's feet back on the floor. Terry bends over, gulping in the fresh air. But before any of them can start to mentally collect themselves, they all hear a thump, feel the building shake a little, and hear the telltale scraping noise from claws on concrete. Ladies and gentlemen, Elvis is in the building. The boys move to the concrete half wall that looks out down onto the 1st floor and see this thing moving in past the shield wall. They watch its head appear in the firelight, followed by shoulders that ripple the surrounding muscles as it walks, and the rest of the jet black, impossibly long body, until finally the tail signals the end of this living mammoth. The firelight casts this massive shadow on the wall that just keeps growing and growing until the entire wall behind it is dark. They see it scanning the room and sniffing the air, obviously looking for them. They stand frozen in place, praying to God that the relatively windy night air coming through the building might either hide their scent or send it off in a different direction. As they are all transfixed on the beast, willing themselves into living statues, they hear a new sound, almost like a light crackling noise. Matt sees what looks to be a trail of water drops following the creature. Putting the drops together with the crackling noises, realizes this thing is salivating to the point that it's drooling onto the concrete, making the pitter-patter noises like a sprinkler on a driveway. That tells Matt one thing. This thing is looking for dinner. As it slowly moves around the first floor and around the fire, the boys notice two things. First, the pure jet blackness of this whole creature is actually broken up by a faint white stripe going from its shoulders to its tail. And second, its huge white teeth with canines so long that they hang out of its mouth even when it's closed. And its eyes are still burning at top intensity. That internal amber shine that is so bright, Matt can see an orangish glow being cast wherever it looks. Now, the idea that this monster is a natural being is heart attack inducing enough. But what Matt sees next convinces him they are dealing with something way beyond this world. He watches it walk around the fire, and as it gets close, one of its hands or paws or whatever you want to call it kind of blinks out. Like just for a couple of seconds, it's cloaked like Predator. But that's not all. While it's cloaked out, Matt and Pete can see. The other two don't see it because of their angle, but Matt and Pete both can see almost like an energy signature, like the plasma ropes you see in videos from the surface of the sun. Then everything goes back to normal, if you can call it that. The creature still has its nose in the air, trying to pinpoint the location of the boys. The wind must take a bad turn for the boys because the next thing they see is the creature's head snap around and eyes staring directly at them. The jig is up. It knows where they are, and it bares its teeth and growls that deep, throaty growl again. And Matt feels the vibration from it, just like he did before, but sounds don't travel well through concrete. So the concrete half wall that they're standing in front of must have blocked at least some of the sound waves, because this time they don't feel weak and sick like they did before. The beast stands back up on two legs near one of the giant concrete pillars, allowing the boys to get a sense of its true height. Their estimate? 10 to 12 feet tall. It stands there in an almost comic book buff bodybuilder pose, which would be comical if they weren't also terrified. And it also lends credence to Matt's theory that it has to be fake. But it's not. It's standing right there in front of all four of them. Whatever it is the alpha predator of alpha predators. It scans the room first to its left and then to its right. Bingo, a staircase. It looks back at the boys and Matt's stomach drops because he and this thing both know what it's going to do next. It drops back down to all fours and heads for the stairway. And even though this stairway is missing like 4 stairs, so the boys would have to jump up and kind of climb their way past the missing stairs, this thing jumps the void like it's not even there. Matt watches in simultaneous horror and fascination at how fluid and graceful its movements are, and how it looks like it uses its tail as kind of a rudder to help it balance and steer as it makes its way from the first floor to the second. As the space between them and the monster gets smaller, a whole new wave of panic erupts from the boys. Terry starts screaming and just running in circles until he finally makes a break for the stairs that take you to the 4th floor. Doug runs for the fire escape that will take him to the roof. That leaves just Matt and Pete standing there in utter paralysis, not having any idea what to do as the creature continues moving from the 2nd floor to the 3rd. Matt knows that when it finally does make it to the 3rd, the first thing in its path is him. This is the point where Matt begins to understand that he's going to die. He's only 14. He doesn't have an entire lifetime of memories to flash in front of his eyes, but he thinks about his mom and his dad and his 4 brothers and sisters. He thinks about his dog that he adores. He thinks about how he was all set to go to high school and play football at the same private school his dad had played at. But none of that is ever going to happen now. It's all gone. Instead, they're all going to be mauled and eaten by this monster. Matt just hopes he's not the last one who has to watch all the others die first. The creature gets to the top of the stairs where Matt and Pete are just standing there, not knowing where else to go. It's standing there 6 or 7 feet from Matt, close enough that a half a pounce from this thing would land it right on top of Matt. But that doesn't happen. In an event that Matt can only describe as divine intervention, just as he can see the monster's muscles tightening in readiness to pounce, a train goes by. And not only that, but it blows its horn, something that never happens. Trains going through this area never blow their horns unless it's an emergency. They never had before, and they never have since, but one did that day. Matt will never know if it blew the horn because it saw the fire and thought the building was on fire, or maybe someone saw something unbelievable happening on that 3rd floor. Whatever the reason, that horn was enough commotion to change the beast's focus from the boys to the train. The boys start screaming at the train, "Help us! Somebody help!" Matt can see an indecision wash over its face as it looked back and forth between them and that train. Dinner or safety? The indecision is replaced with a flash of anger as the monster's muscles seem to twitch one last time in Matt and Pete's direction, like a bully pulling out that last major flinch move. Like one last burst of terror from the boys is the minimum payment it will accept for having to give up an easy meal. With that, it turns and heads back down the stairs. It shoots down to the 1st floor impossibly fast, then starts heading for the door. But just before it leaves the firelight for the darkness, Matt sees its movements freeze. It's not the beast that freezes. It keeps going. It doesn't stop. But the animal form, the monster form that they see stops as it transitions into a sort of formless shadow and continues on out into the darkness. Matt and Pete turn their attention back to the train, still yelling for someone to help them. I mean, whatever this thing is, it's still out there. And they swear they hear the train slowing. And maybe it did, but it didn't stop. It just continues down the track until the boys can no longer see or hear it, taking their hopes of rescue with it. What little glimmer of hope they had is crushed as the fear comes roaring back. Now, the train is gone. Is it going to come back and kill them? Terry and Doug come back down to the 3rd floor, thinking that Matt and Pete's cries for help meant that they're all going to be saved. They all look at one another and all can see the toll this encounter has taken on all of them. Pale faces, shaking. All they want to do is curl up into 4 little balls and lay there for a while. But they can't. They cannot take the chance that this thing's going to come back for them again. However, that means to get home, they have to embark on a minimum half-hour trek to get to the closest point of safety. And none of them has the guts to try that, knowing that this thing could be waiting for them to leave the building before it comes back for dinner. So they stay there for the next hour, every minute of which is spent thanking God for keeping the monster away, trying to mentally psych themselves up and gird their loins for the gauntlet they are going to have to take, and trying to calm Terry, who has completely lost it. He's crying and screaming, "I just want to go home. I just want my mom and dad. We can't go out there. It's going to be waiting for us." And who can blame him? He's not saying anything that they're not all thinking. All four of them keep glancing back at that doorway, that space between the Spartan shields, waiting to see the glowing amber eyes staring back at them. But they never appear. Finally, they summon the courage, or at least enough will to survive, to move down to the second floor. Terry still losing his mind, so they just drag him along with them. They wait there for another half an hour. Same drill as before, watching for glowing eyes, psyching themselves up before they get the courage to go down to the first floor. Once there, they realize they can't really wait any longer. They're already out later than they should be. And even if they're not being stalked by a monster, this is not the place for kids to be this late at night. They have to make a run for it now. Terry, still off the deep end, and is begging the others not to make him go out there. Finally, Matt snaps, grabs Terry again, and says, "Listen, we are leaving. You are coming with us. If you don't, that thing is going to come back here and kill you, and you are going to die here alone. So you either come with us now or you stay." But Terry just keeps screaming, "Don't leave me!" So finally, Matt and Pete just grab Terry by the arms and pull him from the building out onto that concrete apron where they first saw this thing and where they last saw this thing. The next move is to jump down and start running. Easier said than done. This outcropping is off the ground by a few feet, so it would be really easy for anything to hide underneath and just wait for them to come out before attacking them. So with the biggest leap of faith that any of them will ever have to make in their lives, they jump down and start running. And they are running as fast as they can while still staying together as a group. Terry is holding onto Matt and Pete's shirts from behind, too afraid of being left behind to let go, and choking them both in the process. But as they get further and further away from that building, Terry relaxes and starts running on his own. So all four boys are just hoofing it as fast as they can in a solid group, with every one of their senses on high alert, waiting for the monster to come after them. Every kicked rock, every leaf blown into their path sends their panic back to DEFCON 1. After the longest half hour of their lives, with maybe the exception of the time that they were still in the building, they finally make it to the last big hurdle before they're practically home free. The gravel hill. To get out of this area and back to civilization, they need to climb this hill of loose gravel that's somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 feet tall. Going down is easy. You just have to turn to the side and slowly walk down. But going up is a different story. You have to go up on all fours, and even if you take it slow and steady, there's at least a 50-50 shot that the gravel is going to give way under your feet and send you sliding back down. Usually, they would laugh at each other as they all struggled up the hill together, making fun of the first person who starts to slide, knowing that it's most likely going to happen to all of them at least once. But nobody is laughing right now. Not to mention the fact that getting to the top on a good day is exhausting. Right now, they got nothing in the tank but an overdose of adrenaline. That hill may as well be the cliffs of insanity! But there's no way around it. So they all just start up the hill. And like always, they all take turns sliding back down. Except this time, every slip backwards comes with a heart-stopping certainty that there is a monster waiting at the bottom to kill them. Is it behind me? is the call that comes out of each one of them at least once as they all struggle not to take 2 steps back for every 1 step forward. Finally, Matt and Pete manage to get to the top and pull the other 2 up as well. They all run across the highway, hop the fence on the other side, cross the street, and collapse on Doug's front porch. Now, this is the point where I wish I could say they all live happily ever after, but they don't. Terry doesn't talk for 2 weeks. And when they all, as a group, tell each of their parents, their reactions on the scale from, "I believe you," to "you're nuts, quit lying," run the entire spectrum. Matt, growing up Catholic, decides to go see a priest at his church. He tells the priest the entire story, fully expecting the priest to chastise him for concocting such an obscene story. Much to his surprise, the priest believes every word. He tells Matt, "God saved your life, Matthew, and you need to understand that sometimes these things bleed into our world, and sometimes they take us." The Pennine region in England, between Lancashire and Yorkshire, is commonly referred to as UFO Valley, which means absolutely nothing to Leocadia Adamski. Not only does it have no bearing on her day-to-day life, but especially now that she is too busy worrying about her husband, Zygmunt, who's been missing for 12 days. But the person about to knock on her door will change her world forever. Leocadia, or Lottie as she is known, is beside herself. She's a wreck with worry today. Her husband of 29 years, Zygmunt, or Ziggy, has been missing for 12 days now. He went out for a bag of potatoes and never came home. And there might be a joke in there somewhere if she didn't feel like her world was crashing down around her. Lottie and Ziggy are Polish immigrants who, after both having nasty run-ins with the Nazis after they invaded Poland in 1939, fled to the Leeds area of the UK. Eventually, they met and were married in 1951. And since they both have had enough drama in Poland, they settled down in the small town of Tingley, just outside of Leeds, to build themselves a nice, quiet life together. And they do a pretty good job of it. Ziggy gets a good, stable job at the coal mine that supports them both. But life is not life without some drama. Since they moved to Tingley, Lottie was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis and is now in a wheelchair. But they've managed to build a good community of friends and family and are both well liked by everybody. Ziggy and Lottie are never able to have any children of their own. So instead, Ziggy kind of leans into his relationship with his goddaughter, and the two become pretty close. So close that Ziggy is set to walk her down the aisle for her upcoming wedding. But then it happened. The day before the wedding, Lottie will never forget that day, June 6th, 1980, when her world stopped. Ziggy went shopping that morning with his cousin Laska, who had been staying with them for a couple of months. After the two came home and had lunch with Lottie, Ziggy gets up from the table and announces that he's running down the street because he forgot to buy the potatoes that they're going to need for the next day's festivities. He grabs his striped coat and his wallet and heads out the door. He walks to the store, buys his bag of potatoes, and starts heading back to home, but stops to chat with the neighbors for a few minutes. And that is the last time anyone has seen Ziggy in the last 12 days. The grocery store is like a whole 3 blocks down the road. So to walk there, buy potatoes, and walk back should have taken all of 15-20 minutes max. So after half an hour, Lottie sends Laska out to see what the problem is. But Ziggy is nowhere. Lottie starts calling everyone she can think of and raising the alarm that something is wrong, including calling the police. The police tell her to just sit tight for a day or two and just see what happens. Surely he will be back in time for the wedding. But he wasn't. So she files a missing persons report, and the police start checking around a bit, talking to family, friends, and neighbors. And they talk to one of Ziggy's closest friends, Christopher Solinsky, who'd been out at the pub with Ziggy just 2 days before he disappeared. He told police that Ziggy seemed like his normal, cheery self. He described the Adamskis' marriage as happy and said that there's no way that Ziggy would voluntarily disappear and leave his wheelchair-bound wife, Lottie, to fend for herself. No way. But so far, no one has either seen or heard a thing. No leads, no theories, nothing. He's just gone. So Lottie has done nothing for these last 12 days except sit in her chair and pray that God will return her Ziggy. Then, a knock at the door. A young man who was visiting Lottie gets up and answers the door for her. Standing on her front steps are a detective and police constable Alan Godfrey. The two officers come in and inform Lottie that they are there because they heard she had filed a missing persons report about her husband. They had some pictures to show her. Pictures, it turns out, of Ziggy. 7 days earlier, on June 11th, Alan Godfrey is standing on a stoop, having a smoke and trying to stay out of the rain, when a call comes on his radio asking officers to respond to an incident at the Tomlinson coal yard. I'm on my way. What's going on?
The body's been found.
As he steps out into the rain, a police car pulls in front of him, driven by his friend and fellow cop Malcolm, who tells him to get in, and the two are off to the coal yard. When they get there, they are greeted by 2 paramedics and Trevor Parker, the son of the coal yard's owner. "We think you have a murder," came the greeting from one paramedic. Malcolm and Alan look around, but they don't see a body anywhere. So they both look back at the paramedics, kind of confused. And one paramedic says, "Look up." So they scan a little higher and spot it. At the very top of one of the coal piles, about 15 feet up, is something that definitely doesn't belong there. The two officers work their way up the pile, the coal constantly shifting under their feet as they go. And Alan notices something. As he and Malcolm are climbing, they're messing up this once perfect pile. But if it was perfect when they got there, how did this body get up there without messing it up? The body is lying face down, so the two men turn it over, and even as seasoned policemen, they are not prepared for what they see. The face that rolls over to greet them is a frozen picture of fear, with eyes wide open and a mouth fixed in a silent scream. Alan recoils for a moment, but then years of training quickly take over and he starts examining the scene. The body is that of an older male wearing a nice brown suit. Interesting though, the suit is perfectly clean, while Alan and Malcolm are now covered in coal dust. How did he climb up here without so much as a smudge of dust on his clothes? Also, there's something off about the suit. The jacket is buttoned wrong, the pants are buttoned wrong, and he's only wearing a string vest under the jacket. It's like someone dressed him in these clothes and got it wrong. And it looks like someone gave him a really bad haircut. Like someone had just taken scissors and hacked away a few bits, some of them down to the scalp. Alan and Malcolm can't see any obvious cause of death, but they do see an open wound on the back of his neck at the base of his skull that looks to have some kind of greenish ointment smeared all over it. And they can also see a few penny-sized spots around his head and shoulders that look like burn marks. Well, there's not much more that they can do now, so they climb down the pile and call the Criminal Investigation Department. While they're waiting for the CID guys, they talk to Trevor Parker, the young man who discovered the body. He says he was at the coal yard this morning and didn't see anything out of the ordinary. The coal yard is just this huge fenced-in area with piles of coal all around. And trucks go in and out throughout the day, either bringing in more coal or loading some up to take away. Trevor then leaves for lunch and to check on some of the other coal yards. And when he comes back around 3:45, he immediately sees something lying on top of one of those piles. He goes to check it out, sees a shoe, and calls the paramedics, thinking that it is yet another stray drunk who's found his way into the coal yard. Apparently it happens a lot. The pathologist who did the autopsy, Alan Edwards, noted that this guy had apparently been eating well and wasn't malnourished or dehydrated, although it doesn't look like he ate anything on the day that he died. And there's only about 1 day's worth of stubble on his face. And the time of death is calculated as being between 11:15 a.m. and 1:15 p.m. on the 11th. So the same day that he was found on the coal pile. So apparently right after Trevor left for lunch. And the burn marks around his head and shoulders look like some type of acid burns that he estimates to be about 2 days old. And the greenish jelly substance over the wound at the base of the skull is tested, and they can't identify it. There are no defensive wounds. The only other wounds on the body are a few small light cuts on the palms of both of his hands, both knees, and a small cut on the right thigh. The cause of death is ruled as heart failure, or more specifically, a combination of emphysema and ischemic heart disease. In other words, natural causes. Alan Godfrey is tasked with trying to figure out who this John Doe actually is. So he hits the pavement, checking out shops and pubs in the Todmorden area, but no one has ever seen this guy. He calls all the area hospitals to see if anyone has been treated for a head wound in the last few days, and nothing. Eventually, someone connects the dots and clues Alan Godfrey into a missing persons report of a man that sounds an awful lot like his John Doe. But it's from Tingley. That's almost 25 miles or 40 kilometers from Todmorden. What would he be doing out here? But lacking any other leads, Alan and the detective assigned to the case make that fateful trip to Tingley on June 18th, which lands them on Lottie's doorstep. She's heartbroken, but there's really not anything else that she can do but wait for the coroner's inquest to hopefully get some answers as to what the hell happened to her husband. Now, a coroner's inquest is a formal legal investigation conducted by the coroner with the help of the pathologist into a death where either the cause of death or the circumstances surrounding it remain unknown. In Ziggy's case, the coroner sticks to the pathologist's findings that Ziggy dies of natural causes. It's the circumstances surrounding it that are the issue. Despite protestations from Alan and Malcolm, they rule that Ziggy died where he was found. Alan and Malcolm are not even called to testify. Okay, fine. But if he disappeared on the 6th and he died on the 11th, where was he for those 5 days? And how did he end up at the top of the coal pile? Trevor Parker testified that he was not expecting any deliveries that day, so he didn't come in on a truck and get dumped. And that nice brown suit he was wearing? It wasn't his. Lottie confirmed that those were not the clothes Ziggy was wearing when he left the house. And where are his wallet and watch? The closest thing to a rational explanation to this entire scenario is that Ziggy had been kidnapped by a family member and held in a shed for 5 days. Remember Ziggy's cousin, Laska? Well, apparently she was staying with Ziggy and Lottie because things were not going well between her and her husband. Like, restraining order bad. So the theory is that Laska's husband, in a fit of rage, kidnaps Ziggy and tortures him for 5 days before Ziggy's heart just can't take it anymore and gives out. And exactly how did he think this would make things better with his wife? Police find zero evidence that this is how things actually went down. It just doesn't make sense. If that's what happened, why would Laska's husband dump Ziggy's body in a wide open area in the middle of the day when the chances of getting caught are pretty high? And if they dragged his dead body to the top of the pile, why aren't Ziggy's clothes covered in soot? And why bother to drag a heavy body to the top of the coal pile? And bonus, if he was dragged up there by someone, how did the pile of coal show no signs of anyone climbing it? Nonetheless, the coroner's inquest concludes with an open finding. In other words, they have no idea. But once the inquest is over, the coroner, James Turnbull, gives an odd statement to the press. The question of where he was before he died and what led to his death could not be answered. In my 12,000 cases, this is the most baffling I've ever had. If I was told a UFO took this man up and dropped him on the coal pile, I would only raise one eyebrow. Sounds like a weird end to a weird story, right? Well, it is, but that's not the end. At least not for Officer Alan Godfrey. As ticked off as he was about the results of the coroner's inquest, he managed to eventually leave all of the unanswered questions in the past and get back to his regular life as a Todmorden beat cop. Life was pretty much back to normal until the rainy, dreary evening of November 27th, 1980. So just 6 months after the discovery of Ziggy Adamski's body on the coal pile. Alan has just started his night shift and is on his way to the northwest part of Todmorden to check out a report of a number of escaped cows out on an unsanctioned walkabout. When a second call comes in, somebody else has spotted the cows. But when Alan finally gets there, he doesn't see any cows. And that's when it dawns on him, he's been punked, and so he just heads back to the station. But then a third call comes in from the same neighborhood complaining about the cows. But this time it's an old lady, not likely a practical joker. So he heads back out there. He gets to the house around midnight and is greeted at the door by a lovely older woman who invites him in and offers him some tea. And she explains that she had been sleeping but woke up because of some strange noises outside. She looked out the window and she saw 5 or 6 cows in the street, puts in her call to the police, and goes back to the window to keep tabs on those hooligan cows. It's then that she's hit with a blinding light that lights up her entire house. When the light fades, the cows are gone. Alan suggests that maybe it was just the headlights of a car passing by that scared the cows away. The old woman isn't so convinced. The following morning, toward the end of Alan's all-nighter shift, so now the morning of November 28th, at about 5 a.m., 3 officers in Halifax are wandering around north of the city around the moors. A moor is a low, hilly area covered in only low-growing vegetation and is sometimes wet, containing peat bogs. So these guys are out there checking out a tip on some stolen motorcycles. All 3 of them see a blue, pulsating light hanging just under the low cloud cover and moving erratically, not like any aircraft any of them have ever seen before. The movements are so wild and unpredictable that one of the officers said, "Enough of this, I'm going back to the car." The blue light then heads toward the officers, buzzes over the top of them, and takes off at a crazy fast speed in the direction of Todmorden. About 5 minutes later, in a little town on the outskirts of northern Manchester called Littleborough, 2 police officers sat in their car in the parking lot of a local pub called the White House when they noticed a blue, pulsating light off in the distance, hovering between 2 electrical towers. Oddly enough, neither of them saw the object appear, but they sat there just mesmerized by it. One of the officers makes a sketch drawing of the light while the other radios into the station to let somebody know what it is that they are looking at. They stare at it for a few more minutes before it shoots off at a high rate of speed again towards Todmorden. Roughly 5 minutes later, so around 5:10 a.m., Alan is getting into his car for his last patrol around town before his shift ends. The rain had finally stopped, but he still had those stupid cows on his mind. So he heads off back toward that area to take one more stab at finding them. He's heading north on Burnley Road when he sees something in the road. About 5 minutes later, so around 5:15 a.m., Leonard Smith, the caretaker for Fernie Lee Junior School, which is north of Burnley Road, is walking across the school grounds when he notices something dark in the sky to the south of him, so right over Burnley Road. It's hard to see in the morning darkness, but it looks like it is rising from the road. And it zigzags a bit and then shoots off at an insane speed. Around 45 minutes later, Alan's friend and fellow officer, Malcolm, is just leaving the station at the end of his shift when Alan comes racing up in his police car, stops, rolls down the window, and tells Malcolm to get in now. Malcolm really just wants to go home, but Alan's face is pale with a very dire look. So Malcolm gets in the car and thinks, this better be good. It was. Trying to catch his breath and calm down, Alan tells Malcolm about how he was on his way back to the area of the renegade cows. But just as he was about to take a right off of Burnley Road to head north to the area, he sees something in the road about 100 yards in front of him sitting in the middle of Burnley Road. So he passes the turnoff to go north and heads toward the object, thinking it's a bus that's crashing his jackknife across the road. But then he realizes that this thing is way bigger than a bus and is floating about 5 feet off the ground. By Alan's estimates, it's about 20 feet wide and 14 feet tall. And it's actually diamond-shaped and in two halves, the top half being stationary and the bottom half rotating. And it has a row of dark windows all the way around. Alan hears no sound, but notices the trees and bushes to the sides of the object are shaking all around as if there's a big wind blowing them all over. But Alan doesn't see or feel any wind. Alan stops his car about 30 feet away from the thing and turns on his blue police lights and hazard lights, because whatever it is, it's blocking the entire road. He tries to radio into the police station to let them know there is a problem on Burnley Road, but his personal radio doesn't work. Neither does the radio in the car. So he starts doing what every British constable is taught to do at the site of an accident. Alan takes out his notepad and starts to sketch what he sees. And he remembers starting that sketch, but not finishing it. Because before he has a chance, a brilliant light, like 100 suns, hits Alan's face. By the time the blindness from the light flash clears, the object is gone. And Alan is another 50 yards up the road with his hands on the steering wheel and the car rolling along in first gear. Blue police lights are off, hazard lights are off, and the headlights of the car are off. Alan quickly turns the car around and goes back. Now, remember, it's been raining all night, so everything is still wet except for that spot on the road. It's dry with a whirlpool pattern of twigs lying on the road. Now, it's almost 6 a.m. 30 minutes gone, literally in a flash. Malcolm doesn't know what to say about Alan's story as Alan drives him back to the spot where he saw whatever it is that he saw. And they get out of the car, and Malcolm can see the dry circle on the road with the whirlpool of twigs, just like Alan had described. He knelt down and touched the dry patch of the road. And despite it being a cold, rainy November morning, the dry patch is warm. They look around, and Alan remembers that they are right next to Centervale Park, hoping maybe to find some early morning joggers or dog walkers who had witnessed what Alan had witnessed. They grab their flashlights and head toward the park. They have to cross a small bridge that spans a gully that runs almost the entire length of the park, parallel to Burnley Road. And when they get to the main gate, it's locked. To climb over the fence and just start walking through the park. And in the pre-dawn darkness, Alan can barely make out the outline of a number of dark shadows moving around on the other side of the park. He shines his flashlight in that direction, only to see, staring right back at him, the faces of a half a dozen cows. In the days and weeks that followed, Alan learned a number of very important things. First, he learned that it would be really hard for cows to wander from the neighborhood where they were first spotted through town, across the road, over the gully next to the road, and through the locked gate of the park. He also learned that the road leading to the house of the little old lady who served him tea while telling him of the disappearing cows was not situated in a way where lights from oncoming traffic could shine through her windows. Whatever that light was that shined in her house was not from a car. And he learned that all records concerning both Ziggy Adamski's death and his own encounter, including the reports filed to the Ministry of Defense by not only himself, but the 3 other officers from Halifax as well, are totally locked down as classified. There's actually a lot more to Alan's story than I could cover here, but he wrote a book called Who or What Were They that details his entire ordeal that I will link in the description below if you care to take a deeper look into his story. So, what plucked Ziggy from the face of the earth, killed him, and set him back down on that pile of coal? And what happened in that 30-minute chunk of time that Alan lost that morning on the road? Do they have anything to do with each other? Or are these events just some massive coincidence? As much as I would love to say the truth is out there, in this case, I'm not sure we're ever going to find it. It's the summer of 1992, and Darren has decided to live the best summer of his life. He has been fishing and camping and hiking throughout his entire youth. But that is all about to come to an end with 2 simple words: I do. But before that happens, he plans to make the most of this last summer. Darren leaves his parents' house early that morning with a pistol on his hip and a rifle in his trunk. The park he's headed to is just a couple hours away and is usually pretty quiet. He's heard all the wild stories about it, and he's anxious to see it for himself. At first glance, Darren is not disappointed. Off in the distance, he can see a mix of open field and dense forest scattered around the rolling hills. To the left of the road is a dry riverbed, and Darren makes a mental note that it would make a great trail for him to follow. If it weren't for the occasional rock fence covered in moss, there would be no way to tell that humans had ever even touched this area. Darren feels the familiar thrill of a new adventure as he climbs out of his truck and starts down the riverbed trail. After a couple of hours and a couple of rest breaks, Darren comes to a spot where the creek narrows with 3-foot banks on either side. A cluster of trees sits to his left, and to the right is an open field of wildflowers. The wind that Darren has felt on his face and heard whistling through the trees all day has quickly disappeared. and been replaced with something dark. It's a gut-twisting feeling that comes out of nowhere. He stops and he holds his breath, afraid even to exhale, though he has no idea why, and tries to stay positive, not give in to the negativity that feels palpable around him. Then he sees it up ahead. 100 yards to his right is something dark. It's as if the negativity has taken physical form. There's no movement or sound, yet Darren feels it demand his attention. Slowly, Darren reaches for his binoculars and immediately is hit with a blast of,
"Don't do that."
He stops dead for a single moment before continuing to lift them to his eyes. Why didn't Darren listen to that inner voice? Up ahead in the bushes is a thing, a massive, black, hairy thing. He tries to tell himself it's a bear, but he can't lie that well. It's a little after noon and the sun is high in the sky. The downward shadow it casts makes the thing's face darker. Its eyes are cloaked under its massive brow, but somehow Darren knows it is glaring at him. In contrast to that black face, he can see its white fangs. There's no definition to its chest, but he can tell it's incredibly wide. Darren feels sick. His knees buckle and his head begins to swim. As he reaches for the riverbank to steady himself, the creature vanishes. He feels his body relax just a little bit as he thinks, "Oh, thank God it's gone." But just a moment later, his body tightens once again as he sees it pop its head up again. This time only 70 yards away, staring with dark, evil intent at Darren through black, vacant eye sockets. He hears it speak in his head.
"If only you hadn't looked."
It stretches up and over as if it's getting a better look, and then it vanishes again. Darren stumbles backward, fighting the urge to turn and run. His mind races. Some people will tell you that they think of their loved ones, or they might say maybe the idea of being part of a missing 411 phenomena crossed their minds. Well, that isn't the case with Darren. He thinks about how this thing might attack him and how bad it's going to hurt. He also wonders how long it would take to die, and if it would rip him apart or eat him while he still struggles to get away. Every thought that pops into his head is a horror worse than the last. Now, Darren hears it making noise, as if it's taunting him, like it wants him to be afraid. Is it true that blood is sweeter when adrenaline is dumped into it? Is that why it seems to be toying with him? It stomps and breaks branches and huffs as it again ducks out of sight and moves through the brush. And again, it raises its head, only 40 yards away this time. Its details are much clearer now, and it's even more grotesque than Darren had even imagined. Its face is glistening in the sun, and a patch on its chest also shimmers. Silvery strings run from the corners of its mouth. That mouth splits its face in two. It's wide and slightly parted, looking like a sinister grin. Its head and its body are all one. If it has a neck, it is surrounded by pure muscle. Again, it vanishes, and each time it does, it moves so fast that it blurs out of sight. This sick game of peekaboo is more than Darren's mind can take in. Part of him is resigned to the idea that he is not leaving this place alive, while another part, a more primitive part, wants to run. Still, another part of him says he needs to fight. As these options are swirling around in his head, the emotions that go along with them combine to create a head-spinning, stomach-churning mess. Darren slowly starts to back up, afraid to look behind him or even turn his head. The noises are getting louder and closer, and he starts praying. It pops its head up again from 20 feet away and cranes its neck to see him. It towers over the bushes that Darren estimates are about 6 feet tall. It starts moving out from the cover of the brush and is heading toward the clearing across from him. And Darren begins to cry. This is it. This is how it's going to end. Until his survival instinct snaps him out of his self-pity as the thing disappears once again into the thick green underbrush. Then it steps out of the brush, leaning forward at the waist, its arms hanging at its sides. They are tipped with claws that Darren can't stop staring at. Its huge chest heaves with each quickening breath, like it's psyching itself up for something. Then it goes silent, and Darren's blood turns to ice. As if in slow motion, it bends its knees, leans forward, and throws its arms back, ready to jump. Darren stumbles backwards in a feeble attempt to get out of the way when, boom! Something explodes to Darren's left, raining debris over the entire creek bed. Darren feels a gust of wind as this reddish-brown blur roars past him, colliding right into this creature's chest. For a brief second, Darren sees nothing in front of him but empty space, but is hit by a scream coming from the other side of the brush, a scream so loud and primal it pulsates through his entire body, followed by deep thumps that shake the very ground with a force he has never known. He rolls over and wills his body to move, but it doesn't respond. He can only lie there, feeling and hearing what sounds like a war zone all around him. When he finally does start to move, to his complete horror, he finds himself drawn to the noise, to the chaos, like a moth to flame. Darren shuffles to the edge of the creek and slowly peeks over the edge. 30 feet away in the clearing, 2 leviathans are locked in battle, biting, clawing, clubbing, and tearing at each other. It is primal, raw, and vicious, and Darren clamps his hands over his ears to block out the enraged roars that each bite elicits. And that's when it clicks for Darren. The realization that he was saved by a Sasquatch. He's watched all the shows and seen every YouTube video. Darren snaps back to reality, if you can call it that, just in time to see the other creature get its feet up against Bigfoot's chest and with a massive kick, flip the Sasquatch onto its back. The creature leaps on him, biting down on his upper thigh. The scream of pain is even louder than the others, and once again, Darren collapses to the ground, covering his head. The young Sasquatch is now in trouble, trying to shield itself from the endless series of blows coming from the creature. He is losing. Darren knows he has to do something. If that creature wins, Darren will be right back in the crosshairs. And then he remembers he has a gun. There's no way he can kill it, but he can distract it long enough to give the Sasquatch a chance. Darren takes a deep breath and takes aim. The flurry of movement in front of him is making it impossible to get a clean shot. Most of the creature's body is just moving too fast, until with almost adolescent pleasure, Darren becomes aware of one body part not in continual motion. It's behind. Darren holds his breath and starts to squeeze the trigger when a massive scream, louder than all the others he's heard so far, erupts through the trees on his right. Swinging his gun in the direction of whatever this new catastrophe is, Darren beholds an even larger beast crush through the tree line, speeding directly toward the melee already in progress. The monster forgets his current target and prepares for the incoming offensive, but it's too late. The larger Sasquatch has already landed, smashing the creature in its back so hard that its head snaps back and bounces off its hulking back with a loud crack. It goes limp and falls face first onto the ground. The two Sasquatch stand over the creature's motionless body, watching, waiting. At last, a solid kick to the side seems to satisfy them that the monster will never move again. The victorious Sasquatch raises his head and bellows out a mighty roar before dragging his foe's lifeless body off into the forest darkness. Darren stands up and catches the attention of the younger beast, who is still a good 9 feet tall. It studies Darren as it begins cautiously advancing in his direction. When Darren realizes that he still has his rifle at his shoulder with his finger on the trigger pointing right at the beast. Darren lowers his rifle and the Sasquatch seems to relax a bit. However, it starts to move toward him even faster. Whether it's fear or maybe an adrenaline crash, who knows? But Darren's vision starts to dim and shrink to a tunnel, and the earth begins to spin. And the last thing Darren remembers is his confusion as to how the earth could be coming up to meet his face. When he wakes up, his pounding head and rolling stomach make him feel like he's waking up from the bender to end all benders. Darren puts his head between his knees and inhales the cool night air. And then he looks around. He is sitting on the ground, leaning up against his truck with his rifle next to him. Was that all a nightmare? Did he even leave his parking spot? Or did he nod off instead, his mind creating the most epic monster smackdown movie in his head while he slept? Darren begins to replay the events that he remembers and concludes, must have been a dream. There's no way that was real. And he convinces himself that he never left his truck. He stands up off the ground and turns to get into the truck. He doesn't even really want to go camping anymore. He just wants to go home. That is when Darren sees the huge handprint, perfectly imprinted on the dust on the hood of his truck, placed exactly where somebody would place their hand to steady themselves while setting something on the ground. Darren freezes as the bombshell of truth of what actually just happened to him explodes in his mind. He has never moved so fast in his life. He gets in the truck, takes off, never looks back, and never tells this story to anyone. For years, that thing has stalked his dreams. And on the bad nights, it catches him. It was 1995 and Tony had just graduated from high school. And as he's hanging out with a friend of his, John, that he hasn't seen in 7 years, Tony asked John, "You ever been to New Orleans?" John said no. And Tony said, "Let's go." And they did. Between the two of them, they had $140. But back then, that was more than enough. They made it to New Orleans, almost died of culture shock, and turned around and headed to Magnolia, Mississippi to get some sleep. They stayed at the Magnolia Inn, which was pretty crappy, but it was clean and cool. And it was May or June in South Mississippi, so cool was the only adjective that mattered. And they stayed up that night playing poker, drinking Gordon's vodka, and talking about who knows what. Probably girls, or college girls. And at some point, John said, "Ever been to Texas?" And Tony said, "No." And John said, "Well, pack up, let's roll." They had a road atlas and saw that Marshall, Texas was just across the border from Shreveport, Louisiana. Now, Tony says he doesn't know what it's like now, but back in 1995, Shreveport looked and smelled like the place that metal and oil went to die. It was dirty and gross. At one point, they crossed a bridge and saw people fishing just 100 yards downstream from where a factory was draining waste into the river. And the locals reminded him of locals from his own hometown. Bald-headed women, cross-eyed men, and bald and cross-eyed children. And Tony said he apologizes for that description, but he said it really was like a Rob Zombie movie come to life. The best part of Shreveport was an armadillo that may have had leprosy. But Marshall, Texas was 40 miles away, so they rolled on. Marshall was a decent little town, home of the Fire Ant Festival. So they stopped at a local barbecue joint and had a Coke, a Smile, and some pulled pork. And it was starting to get late. The sun was setting. So they pulled out their map and they decided to backtrack a little bit so that they could hit Route 43. That would take them through Karnak, and eventually they'd be able to hit Route 59, head to Texarkana, and then head back home. When they did leave the barbecue joint, it was getting dusk, and Route 43 is not well lit. John was driving, and he was doing about 45 miles an hour, because on that road, going any faster, even for a pair of teenage idiots, would have been really reckless. The road was dark and winding and full of hills that ended in curves. And there were lots of pairs of glowing eyes on either side of the road. And they could hear the crickets and the bullfrogs over the engine of that old Sentra. It was peaceful and creepy at the same time. And the humidity was a real thing, tangible. The air was thick and it smelled like pastures and hay and swamps. And they drove for what felt like hours. After midnight, Tony sees a sign that informs them that Bivens is the next town of any real size. And Tony feels himself being hypnotized by the yellow lines on the road. They hadn't seen another car in like an hour, and they are both getting pretty sleepy. So Tony rolls down the window and lights a cigarette, and he remembers that there is music on the tape player, either Tupac or Bob Seger. And he's just sitting there smoking his cigarette, absent-mindedly flicking the ashes out the window. And as he took one last puff and flicked that Camel short out into the woods, that is when he saw it. He hadn't really looked to the right in a while. Maybe he kinda did when he flicked his butt out the window. He doesn't really know. But what he does know is in his periphery, he could see something running with the car. It was just behind his window. And he looks over at the speedometer and it says 40 miles an hour. And he looked at his friend, and his friend is looking straight ahead. So Tony just looks straight ahead. But he could still see it. He could see one huge arm. Matted fur, rusty brown, sticky, almost primal. So he eased his right hand over and rolled up his window. And John is still looking straight ahead with his jaw clenched. And he put both hands on the wheel and sped up. No words were said. Tony still looked straight ahead. But out of his periphery, he could still see that arm moving, muscles and tendons visibly rippling underneath that matted hair. And as the car gained a little speed, the thing running alongside them lost pace slightly. And that is when Tony saw the hand at the end of that nightmarish arm. The hand was clenched in a fist the size of a cantaloupe. A really big cantaloupe. It was covered in the same hair that was slightly darker around the fingers, like it was stained with something. And suddenly, the hand unclenched, and he saw the claws, black as midnight. Those claws were at least 2 inches long and sharp like an animal's. It wasn't a hand so much as it was the paw and claws of a beast whose sole purpose is to kill and eat. So Tony looked at John, looked at the speedometer, 50 miles an hour, and looked straight ahead again. The thing was still there. So Tony lit another cigarette didn't open the window and just said, "Shit." The music had stopped a while ago, and Tony broke the silence by asking John, "Hey, do you..." And before he could finish, John said, "I see it. I've been seeing it for a long time." And Tony asks, "How much do you see it?" And John says, "More than I want to." And Tony says, "Speed up, John. Just speed up. It cannot keep up with us forever." And Tony feels the car start to speed up, looks at the speedometer again, 55 miles an hour. And whatever it is that's chasing them finally starts to lag behind. So Tony musters the courage to just look a little bit to his right. And he says that in his 37 years of life, he only has 2 regrets. One of them is picking up that first cigarette. The other is looking to his right. The beast was huge. Its chest stood above the hood of the car and was covered in that reddish-brown matted fur. And the thing started to bend forward as it ran. And Tony saw the face of this thing. And all reality stopped. They were no longer driving down some road in Texas. They were now trying to escape the depths of some monster-inhabited hell. This thing's face is beyond any power that Tony has to describe it. It is evil. The eyes were black and the pupils were red. And this thing flashed its teeth at Tony in a saliva-dripping snarl with teeth that were yellow and huge. It opened its eyes wide and it looked hungry and pissed. It opened its mouth and the skin pulled back and all you could see were black gums and yellow teeth. And Tony could feel the car start to go faster. Fucking hell, John, just go. And Tony prayed and he cussed and he lit another cigarette. And then, like sunshine breaking through the clouds, the road in front of them straightened out. And Tony just said, "Don't you slow down." They drove through Bivens and on to Texarkana and then home. And they never said a word. It was years later, 11 to be exact, before they even talked about it again. And even then, they didn't talk about it much. John said he hadn't told anyone. Tony said he hadn't either. But Tony says he finally did tell that story for the first time just a few years back when he was parked out on a gravel road doing things that you do out on a gravel road when you're parked there with a good-looking woman. And he told it again about a year or so ago to a couple of kids who wanted a scary story around the campfire. They didn't sleep for a day or two, but they asked him about a dozen more times to tell the story again. But he never told anyone until now that he saw its face. Tony says he's only been scared for his life twice in his life. Once was with a grizzly bear in front of him and a terminal velocity drop down a cliff to the side of him. The second was on that road. And he says you can call it what you will. You can call it bullshit if you want, but look him in the eye, let him tell you the story, and you'll know. Never doubt that there are things in this world that defy logic and explanation. The boogeyman is real. This story comes to us from a man named JC. We are going to call him Jordan. Now, Jordan never really paid much attention to the black-eyed kid phenomena. He went through a phase as a teenager where he studied almost everything paranormal he could get his hands on, so he had heard the usual stories. And the creepy Photoshop pictures of freaky kids seemed to be everywhere online, but he just swiped right by them, chalking them up to an urban legend. These days, he's pretty much a skeptic where spectacular creature phenomena are concerned. Or he was. Recently, Jordan was driving, listening to some really old podcast about black-eyed kids and their original internet post from Abilene, and he almost wrecked his truck. The story is so similar to an experience that he and his boyfriend Craig had a few years ago. Jordan was in Baton Rouge, Louisiana on a date with his new boyfriend, Craig. It's actually their first date, even though they met online over a year ago and have been an official couple for 4 months already. And they decided it was about damn time to meet face to face and decide on a weekend in Baton Rouge for a National College Football Championship, a little bit of partying, and hanging out in general. Their first night there, they decide to see a movie and get to the theater about an hour early so they can make sure that they get good seats. They get their tickets, and still having some time to kill, they decide to walk across the street to the Mall of Louisiana and take a quick look around and do some window shopping. And it's kind of late. It's about 7:30 or so in the evening, so most of the shops are closed. But they decide to go anyway, and if nothing else, just to walk around and stretch their legs. And they've just crossed the street at the crosswalk, right between the theater and the bowling alley arcade, when it happens. They never see them walk up, which is odd because Jordan really has a hyper-focused sense of observation. He grew up in a really bad environment, and he learns early to take note of everyone and everything, no matter if he thinks someone is a threat or not, just in case. Jordan and Craig, who is younger than him and also kind of a smaller guy, have just made it to the other side of the street when seemingly out of nowhere, 2 boys approach them. One looks to be about 16 and the other is about 12 or 13, both of them Caucasian in appearance. And it's just light enough outside to still be able to see that the older one has either brown or sandy blonde hair and the younger one's got brown hair. Jordan's first impression is that their clothes are kind of weird. They look like kind of Abercrombie, kind of Hollister clothes a typical suburban kid might wear, but from the mid-90s, kind of faded almost. The older boy starts talking and immediately creeps Jordan out.
Do you have a car?
He just walks up to Jordan and asks that. But Jordan is a nice guy, and other than the weird feeling that something is a little off, despite it being such an odd question, he decides to answer. At this point, Craig is beside Jordan and slightly behind to his left because he's following Jordan as they're walking and talking. But both stop because of how weirded out they both feel this situation is. Jordan looks at Craig and he has his head down and moves behind Jordan. Jordan is a bigger guy and he can tell Craig is pretty much using him as a human shield. Craig doesn't scare easily. He has never backed down from a fight, and this particular trait has gotten him into trouble before. But now he is hiding behind Jordan. When he sees Jordan looking at him, he raises his head, shakes his head no before putting his head back down. He also isn't on his phone, which is weird because he had just been in the middle of a lively Snapchat conversation like a minute ago. Jordan looks back at the boys, and neither of them has moved. Now, he doesn't know why he decided to answer their question because his first instinct is to lie and get Craig away from there. But he tells them, well, not really. I mean, I have a rental. It's parked over there. And points to the movie theater parking lot.
Can you give us a ride?
Despite the complete sense of uneasiness Jordan has and the extremely strong sense that they do not need to be anywhere near his car, he's curious. Jordan had been a youth pastor and a youth addiction counselor in the past. So when he sees a kid in need, his first instinct is always to help him out and figure out what's going on. Where do you need to go?
We came to the mall, but we need to get back to our house. It's not far from here. Our parents will be mad if we don't get back.
Well, why don't you call them? Maybe they can give you a ride. Despite their average appearance, Jordan is dead set against giving them a ride and notices popping up in his head images of maniacal smiles and his throat being slit from behind. This time, the younger one chimes in.
We don't have phones.
Jordan has a habit of scanning his surroundings, so he looks up to see if other people milling around are trying to get past them on the sidewalk, or looking at the strange conversation of men in the middle of the busy thoroughfare. But just as he looks up, he hears the younger one say,
They're not paying attention.
Jordan hears him say. He never sees him speak, despite standing not even 3 feet from him and his face being very much in Jordan's field of vision. And he's pretty sure the kid is speaking to his brother. The brother looks at him and Jordan hears,
They can help us.
And looking back at Jordan,
They can see us.
Jordan thinks this is odd, but he is more concerned with finding a polite end to the conversation and seeing these boys safely on their way. I really wish I could help you, but there's all kinds of stuff in my backseat and we have to get to a movie soon.
It won't take long. It's not far.
Jordan barely manages to notice that the rest of the people at the mall look kind of washed out, like they're not really there, when he sees the kid's eyes for the first time. They are the palest shade of green. Yep, odd for a black-eyed kid story, but stick with me. His eyes, though Jordan can see them, are kind of ethereal, almost not really there, almost transparent, like ghost eyes. They have bits of yellow in them, maybe even turn blue. He's not really sure, but they are hypnotizing. Jordan sees fear in his eyes, not the I'm about to die fear, but the I need serious help fear. The fear a kidnap victim might feel, or a lost kid. The older boy looks at the younger boy again.
Yeah, he can see us. Ask him for help. He can help us.
Jordan is totally sketched out by now, and he just wants to leave. I can't give you a ride, but you said it's not far. Can you walk? Or do you want to use my phone to call your parents?
They're not home. They're still at work. It's too far to walk. Couple of miles.
By now, Jordan is desperate to get away. The sense of urgency to help is getting too strong, and he doesn't like it because every time he thinks about helping, he gets a stronger sense that he's going to be murdered. He just knows that if he even survives the trip to their house, he will be invited in and he won't be able to refuse. Their parents will be inside and it will be bad. Craig isn't even a thought at this point, except that he's so close behind Jordan that Jordan can actually feel his presence. They have to go. I can maybe give you a couple of bucks for bus fare. The bus stop is right there.
We just moved here. We don't know the bus stops. We just need a ride.
Where are you from?
Far away.
Look, I wish I could help you, but we've got to go. And with that, Jordan starts to walk away, making sure that Craig is behind him. And they walk fast. Jordan turns around about 5 seconds later to look at these two weirdos and make sure that they're not following, and they're gone. Craig is pissed. I can't believe you just did that. Did what? Talk to them. What? They needed our help. They were messed up. What, you mean high? Their pupils weren't dilated. No, they didn't have pupils. They were messed up. I didn't see anything. I can't believe you didn't see anything. I'm telling you, they were messed up. That's why I didn't say anything, and I'm not crazy. I know what I saw. Jordan believes him, kind of. He tries to joke around about their weird attitudes and the insistence on getting in his car. But Craig gets even more upset. Just stop. Stop talking about it. I'm done. I'm not crazy. So Jordan drops it until he hears that story about black-eyed kids on the podcast. He calls up Craig and asks him, "Those guys at the mall back in Baton Rouge, did they have black eyes?" Yeah. And that's all he would say. He's still too scared to talk about it. But looking back, Jordan remembers that weekend. It was bad. Jordan and Craig argued about trivial stuff, and they almost broke up. Craig even developed a nosebleed that night. After he went to bed, Jordan almost went nuts. He drove across town full of this unexplainable angst and stopped at one of the riverboat casinos, the Belle of Baton Rouge. Out on the top deck, Jordan looked down into the water and had this strong urge to throw himself into the Mississippi. It was raining and the water looked rough, and he knew that if he did that, he wouldn't survive. But thankfully, he was able to resist the urge. But that's not even the end. In the weeks that followed, Jordan almost had a nervous breakdown. He was having issues at work that almost cost him his job, and he and Craig almost broke up again. He finally got desperate enough that he went to a psychic who helped him do a cleansing. And things which had slowly been spiraling into an abyss started improving. And a pagan witch friend of his, who was way more experienced at dealing with the paranormal than Jordan, told him these are spirits of kids who were horribly abused in life. Maybe the sins you commit in this life do come back in the next. Hey, InBetweeners! Quick break here to let you know that if you love these stories, want to take them with you wherever you go, we've got you covered. The InBetween official podcast is available now on all your favorite podcast platforms. Just click the link in the description to follow us and never miss an episode. And now, back to our stories. Kevin and Heidi Bardsley have a busy family. With 4 kids that seem to be involved in everything, most of their time seems like it's spent chauffeuring one kid or another from one sport to another or one activity to another. Their youngest, Garrett, is a happy, healthy, 5 foot tall, 110-pound, 12-year-old kid who loves baseball and the outdoors. It's getting close to the end of summer, and Garrett's Boy Scout troop decides to go on a wilderness weekend. It's not an official Boy Scout event. They just want to get out one more time, just one last time before school starts. Their scoutmaster, Wally Trotter, can't join him that weekend because he's got to work, but he brings his son and Garrett's friend, Alex, to the meeting site that Thursday morning to help pack the trucks and see off the other kids and the dads, including Kevin, Garrett, and Garrett's 2 brothers, Cameron and Jared. Thursday, August 19th, 2004, the troop heads up high into the High Uinta Mountains in Utah. They have to hike for about an hour before they even get to their camp, which is somewhere around a circle of lakes called the Cuberant Lakes. Friday morning, Garrett and Kevin wake up early and decide to go fishing to see if they can catch their breakfast. They grab their gear and head out of camp on a well-established trail that they've been on several times already that takes them to the lake shore, less than a quarter mile from camp. Garrett accidentally slips on the shore rocks, getting his shoes and socks wet. So his dad says, "Why don't you head back to camp and get some dry ones?" Kevin watches his son head off down the path to camp, still carrying his fishing pole, until he can't see him any longer. Then he goes back to fishing, just waiting for Garrett to return. After about 15 minutes, Kevin realizes that Garrett hasn't returned yet. So he, too, heads back down the trail to camp. And when he gets there, he asks the other people in the camp, "Where's Garrett?" And they all say, "We haven't seen him." And Kevin knows there's trouble. He and others from their camp start fanning out, calling Garrett's name. He's only been missing for a few minutes, so he can't be that far, right? But their calls are met with silence. Back at home, Wally Trotter is at work trying to be productive, but he notices this intermittent feeling of apprehension that keeps coming over him, making him think that maybe there's something wrong with his son Alex. But eventually, an opposite feeling of peace envelops him, and he knows Alex is fine, and he puts those concerns behind him. Later that morning, Wally's instinct tells him he needs to call Gary Hansen, one of the supervisors on the trip. But he thinks, well, I can't do that because no one on the mountain is going to have cell service. Little did he know that at that very moment, Gary is down from the mountain and starting to make calls for help in searching for Garrett. That's when Wally's phone rings. He listens intently for a moment, tells the caller, I'm on my way, flies into his boss's office and says, I'm out. And he is on his way driving up to the mountain. Wally's thinking, I am sure by the time I actually get there, they will have found him already. But when he arrives at the campsite, he finds that his imagination is far from reality. The good news is that the sheriff's department and the FBI both mobilize quickly in getting a search organized. The bad news is that Garrett is out in the elements without any camping gear except his fishing pole and not much camping experience, much less survival experience. And this is the latter part of August, up at about an altitude of 10,000 feet. So it's chilly, especially at night. And he's only wearing a hoodie with a t-shirt underneath it, sweatpants, and his wet shoes and socks. Within hours, hundreds of law enforcement officers and volunteers are combing the mountainside, most likely all thinking the same thing. He can't be that far. Friday night brings helicopters with loudspeakers calling Garrett's name and searchlights. According to Wally, he's never seen a spotlight that could light up the trees and the mountainside like that one did. How could Garrett not see that? Later that night, after many of the searchers have gone home for the night, several men stay awake all night long, lighting bonfires along the shore of the lake, hoping that they'll act as beacons to guide Garrett back to camp. But it doesn't work, and the temperature drops to 18 degrees that night. Of course, the thing Kevin wants most is to have his son back, but he also wishes his wife Heidi was by his side. And she's on her way, but she is on a cruise with friends when Kevin calls her. Can you imagine how hard that phone call is? To, as a parent, have to call your spouse and tell them that you've lost your child? Heidi says the immediate sick feeling in the pit of her stomach told her all she needed to know. Garrett was never going to be found. But she also knew it was her job to try. So as much as she didn't want to go, she headed for the mountain to be there for her husband and to do everything that she could to find her son. Interestingly enough, Kevin receives the same divine message. On one of the first of many times he would hit his knees to beg God, please, I will do anything you ask. Just let me have my son back. The answer he receives is, you don't have to worry about Garrett. His test is done. Kevin, however, does not want to accept that as an answer. For the next couple of days, he does not stop moving and never runs out of energy. He stays out searching until long after all the other searchers have gone to bed. When he's the last one standing, he hikes to his car, drives to town, and calls people, his wife, his daughter, other family members, just to hear their voices. Then he would drive back up the mountain and force himself to sleep for like an hour or so. Once Heidi arrives on the mountain, Kevin calms down a little, but doesn't stop searching, because searching is the only thing he can do to keep the grief and the panic and the guilt at bay. The only time he ever takes away from the search is to take a few minutes here and there to offer up yet another prayer for the safe return of his son. But even that little respite is getting harder and harder for Kevin to take because he keeps getting the same answer. Don't worry about Garrett. Saturday morning dawns sunny and a bit warmer, which warms up the shivering volunteers and their hope and vigor for another day of searching. But it's also the last day of the scouting trip. It's time for the scouts, including Garrett's brothers and his friends Alex and Tanner, to go home. Wally, remember he's one of the scoutmasters for the troop, helps the boys pack up their gear to go home and admits that one of the hardest things for him of this entire ordeal is watching Cameron and Jared Garrett's brothers pack up his things in his backpack. Guilt is also starting to take its toll. Heidi can't eat or sleep, not when she knows her youngest child is lost out in the wilderness without food or shelter. Saturday night is the hardest for Wally. The nice warm sunshine they had in the morning turns to rain, and by the time he's done searching for the day, he is cold, wet, and tired. He goes back to his tent, changes his clothes, crawls into his sleeping bag, and tries to get some rest. But the scoutmaster in him knows what this means. If Garrett is still alive out there, he's now wet. A wet body and freezing temperatures, Garrett's probably not going to make it through the night. And Wally is overwhelmed with guilt just for being warm. By Sunday, 2 days after Garrett had last been seen, searchers still hold out hope Garrett is alive. But the day brings nothing new. Not to mention that now it starts to snow, which makes looking for any clues almost impossible. And many volunteers, including Wally, have to go home to get ready for work on Monday morning. On Tuesday, the rescue mission is officially changed to a recovery mission, with just 50 search and rescue personnel still searching to bring Garrett home. Wednesday would bring the only clue to ever be found in this entire mystery. Searchers find a sock that Heidi identifies as being Garrett's. It's found about a half a mile from camp in the middle of a wide open boulder field, and it looks like it was taken off and thrown away while it was wet. The number of volunteers swells to about 1,000 on the second weekend, but by Sunday, 9 days after Garrett has gone missing, Summit County declares the official search to be over. No trace of Garrett is ever found except that one sock, not even his fishing pole. But before you start thinking this is the end of the story, it's not. The following year is a really tough one for the Bardsleys. Naturally, they spend every moment that they can on the mountain looking for Garrett, until October, when winter closes that door for him, and reality begins to set in. They notice immediate changes in their family. The 3 remaining kids, Courtney, Jared, and Cameron, grow closer and become more protective and more sensitive to each other. Cameron, he's the one that was closest in age to Garrett, so he takes this loss especially hard. The 2 boys had always shared a room until just a few months before, when Cameron decided he wanted his own room. But after Garrett's gone, Cameron doesn't want to be alone, and Jared immediately takes him into his room and says, "I want Cameron to be with me." Kevin is more sensitive to Heidi's feelings as well and does whatever he can not to add to the pain she's already feeling. Their faith holds them together as a family as they struggle to move away from the easy emotional pit of, why did this happen? Why us? And move toward finding the purpose of it all, because they know that how they react and move forward is totally up to them. And it won't take long before the signs of purpose they're searching for start to show themselves. People start to contact the Bardsleys and share their stories. One man decides to donate money every month to a different charity. Another man, a music teacher on the East Coast, pledges to spend his free time finding and fixing up instruments for inner city schools. One local man who suffers from involuntary convulsions feels a strong urge to join the search for Garrett, despite his disability. His wife says, "Are you nuts?" And the man says, "I went to bed that night and just felt this overwhelming impression that I needed to go." The man drives up the mountain, hauls out his backpack, and starts up the trail, suffering from convulsions the whole way. As the man walks into the forest, the convulsions stop, and he never experiences them again. But the biggest purpose-driven flag comes in June of the following summer. An 11-year-old named Brendan Hawkins is in the Uinta Mountains, just 5 miles from where Garrett went missing the summer before. Brennan is with 1,400 other Boy Scouts at the Bear River Boy Scout Camp. On Friday, June 17th, several boys see Brennan removing his climbing harness after scaling the climbing wall. But no one knows what happens to him after that. He's just gone. As the Summit County Sheriff, Dave Edmonds, is once again organizing a search effort, he puts a call into Kevin Bardsley and says, "You have the experience, you have the contacts, you know what the family is going through. You want to give us a hand?" On Kevin's part, there is no decision to be made, but there is a slight hitch. His daughter Courtney is getting married the following weekend, so it's kind of a busy week for the whole family. Courtney actually shoos him out the door, saying, "Mom and I will take care of wedding stuff. You go." Kevin packs up some food and water, loads up his radios and GPSs, and heads for the mountains. Kevin's presence is a godsend, not only because he brings a lot of experience and volunteers with him, but also because he understands what the Hawkins family is experiencing. He explains the process and calms a lot of their fears. And when he tells them that he truly understands what they're going through, the Hawkins know he truly means it. He is not just blowing smoke. And because of what the Bardsleys went through the summer before, Summit County paid attention and now has a corps of experienced searchers and technical expertise ready to mobilize in the event of another missing child. Brennan is the first on the receiving end of those lessons learned. Heidi, Kevin, and Wally all say Garrett has played a big role in making sure another kid didn't end up like him. Brennan Hawkins is found on the 4th day, 5 miles away and uphill from where he went missing. Kevin says, "I would like to think that Garrett was on the mountain that day that Brennan went missing." Not to mention the fact that because of that search taking place, another scout that was on the mountain who was having serious heart problems was able to be taken to a hospital quickly because there were helicopters already in the area. In August of 2005, so 1 year after Garrett went missing, the Bardsleys organized another search in hopes of finding Garrett's remains. Heidi didn't think Garrett would be found, but she knew that she had to try. Their job, she said, was to do as much as they possibly could. The rest, they trusted to God. She was right. Garrett did not come home. But so many other good things, some might call them miracles, have come from Garrett's search that she and Kevin say it's not a loss. Everything that they have endured so far brought forth blessings to so many lives that have been changed. They know he has saved at least 2 other scouts, and Heidi thinks that they haven't even seen the full extent of his influence yet. Heidi says she thinks that Garrett has touched more lives this way than he would have if he had just lived a regular full life. Garrett's family and the scouts would return once more to the Mirror Lake trailhead in the High Uintas, the same place Garrett was lost. That's where Cameron receives his Eagle Scout Award, which is the highest achievement or rank attainable in the Boy Scouts that only 4% of scouts ever achieve. And since Garrett was working toward that same goal, he was honored with the Spirit of the Eagle, an award for scouts who were working toward their eagle but died before it could be completed. Heidi and Kevin occasionally visit that lake, the lake where Kevin last saw their son, and they appreciate the sacred feeling that the area holds for them. And though it's technically a nameless lake, they and others have named it for a young man whose spirit still lingers. In their mind, it's Garrett's Lake, and it will always be Garrett's Lake. The events in this story could be considered kind of sensitive, so we are changing the names to protect privacy. And all of these events happen at Bridger Lake National Forest Campground in the Wasatch National Forest, which is in the Uinta Mountains in northern Utah, roughly 1 or 2 miles from the border of Wyoming, and only 30 miles northeast of the high Uinta Mountains, where Garrett Bardsley and another Boy Scout would go missing 411 style just 12 years later. I'll put a link to that video in the description if you'd like to see that story as well. So Bridger Lake Campground is pretty deep into the Wasatch Mountains, just east of Salt Lake City. It's a long way to go camping, but Mike, the one who shared this crazy experience, loved that area and describes the drive to get there as damn near a religious experience. Now to back up just a little bit, Mike had this friend in high school named Christy. They kind of lost touch right after graduation, but about 5 years after, in 1992, they run into each other and restart their friendship right where they left off. Except, in the last 5 years, Christy has become kind of a hippie and is now dipping her toes into the world of psychedelics like acid and mushrooms. Not really Mike's scene, but whatever. Now stick with me here. Christy has a good friend named Holly, and Holly has a brother named Ben, who might or might not be gay. I know, sounds random, but it's important later. Christy, our hippie, knows a guy who's become her occasional pot dealer who we'll call Dave. And one day Dave calls Christy and says, I just got my hands on this huge bag of shrooms, which at least in Utah in the early 90s are pretty hard to come by. He says they are the best shrooms I've ever had in my life. One thing leads to another, and Mike, Christy, Ben, and Holly decide to go camping and take a bunch of mushrooms. It'll be fun. And Mike knows just the place, the Wasatch Mountains. At this point, the campground is still kind of a hidden gem that not too many people know about. So they'll be all alone, no one bothering them, and they don't have to worry about bothering anybody else while they're tripping. Big surprise! Christy tells Mike that Dave is coming too. Mike says, hang on a sec. We don't even know this guy. I don't think this is such a good idea. And Christy says, trust me, it's fine. So with a sigh of resignation, Mike says, fine. Christy borrows her brother's Jeep Cherokee because sometimes the roads into the camp aren't the best. She picks up the other three, Mike, Holly, and Ben. Everyone piles into the Jeep, and finally she picks up Dealer Dave. Immediately, everyone wants to see this legendary bag of shrooms. But Dave looks at Mike and Ben and says, I didn't know you guys were coming. I only have enough for 3 people. But after some pushback from the rest of the group, he kind of grumbles and goes back into his house and gets some more. They stop, pick up some supplies, and the excitement for their adventure ahead is starting to build. They cover the 100 miles to Fort Bridger in under 2 hours, and then they have another hour to go to get to the actual campground. And in this 3 hours, Dave is already getting on Mike's nerves. Dave somehow picks up on the fact that Ben is gay, or at least Dave thinks he is. He starts saying these really offensive, demeaning things to Ben, but in a way that's supposed to be funny, but he's not. No one in the car is laughing except Dave, and their excitement starts to dwindle. By the time they reach the campground, Mike is just done with Dave and has to force himself not to shout a big, I told you so. His suspicion is that Christy invited Dave so that they didn't have to pay for the drugs. And he's pretty sure that Dave agreed to come with his drugs because he thought this would be his surefire in with Christy. Mike really wishes they would have just bought the mushrooms and left Dave behind. So they finally get to their camping spot about 1 or 2 in the afternoon. They set up camp, collect wood to get ready for a fire later, bust out the cold beverages for the hot afternoon, and finally start to relax. Mike says, hey, why don't we all do the mushrooms right now? That way, in a little bit, we can all go on a hike while it's still warm. Everybody seems to think this is a pretty good plan, and they all each take a large helping of shrooms from Dave's bag. And as sure as water is wet, 40 minutes later, they all begin to trip a little. Dave brings out a big bottle of cheap whiskey and starts downing the whiskey with cans of pop that he bought. He offers his unique mixture to the rest of the group, but nobody else really wants to drink. So Dave just drinks more and is turning into a pretty nasty drunk. Everything starts to take a dark turn. Dave starts calling Ben these obscene, disgusting names again. And Mike doesn't know Ben very well, but he knows that he's a really sweet, quiet kid. The kind of kid that everybody likes. However, that also means he has a hard time standing up for himself. Mike isn't even entirely sure that Ben is gay. He might just be very shy and awkward. Tempers start to flare, and Holly is getting really pissed off. They're all starting to trip, and it's not a good one. The more Holly defends Ben, the more it incites Dave, who says things like, "You can't even stand up for yourself." Now, Mike gets into it saying, "Why are you badgering him?" But Dave just keeps drinking, and chaos is erupting, with everyone getting pissed off and battling with Dave. The trip is going downhill fast. Finally, Ben is just done. He gets up and storms off down toward the lake. With Ben gone, Dave begins to chill out, but Holly doesn't let it go and proceeds to chew Dave up one side and down the other. And apparently, it works. Dave seems to actually stop and reflect on what a jerk he's been. Everyone kind of goes silent for a while. But eventually, they all start to come back up from the bottom and start going about their business and start talking to one another. And everything seems okay again for a while. Some time goes by and someone finally says, "Hey, how long has Ben been gone?" Nobody has a clue, but it's a long time, like hours. Dave has apparently had an epiphany about his prior behavior and volunteers to go find Ben. Mike quickly chimes in and says, "I'll go with you." Mike can actually sense Dave's change of heart and thinks maybe the rest of the day will at least be tolerable. As they're walking together and chatting, Mike actually gets to talk to Dave a little bit more. And he starts to think, well, maybe Dave's not such a bad guy. Lousy drunk, but not a bad guy. They finally get to the spot that starts to head down toward the lake. The view through the thin, tall trees opens up to a view of the whole lake. And it is so beautiful, it doesn't even seem real. It is literally breathtaking. Both Mike and Dave snap out of their awe-induced paralysis and remember why they're actually there. And they start yelling out, "Ben! Ben!" But there's no response. Now, the trail that they are on splits with two paths, each heading to a different spot by the lake. So Mike and Dave each take a trail, and Mike says, "If you don't find him, I'll meet you back here in 5 minutes." They both agree and go off in their separate directions. Mike starts walking for a while, shouting for Ben, but there's nothing. And with this drama, on top of all the other drama the group has had so far, he wishes he had just stayed home. At this point, he tries to shake off his trip, which is just getting trippier and trippier. Then suddenly, Mike gets this overwhelming feeling of fear. He is completely overcome with terror and the message to stop. Not one more step. So Mike stops and stands there for a second. He's not sure what is causing this sudden panic attack, but suddenly he is way too freaked out to even take one more step forward. And not only is he afraid, but now he's confused. He feels like somebody's watching him. He's tempted to call out to Ben, but he stops himself. Instead, he quickly turns around and starts heading back up the trail. As he's doing his best to outrun that feeling, he notices that the nice sunny weather is now changing. The sky's getting dark and a chilly breeze is starting to blow. Strange, but then again, it's not uncommon to have quick weather changes in the mountains. Suddenly, this incredibly loud, siren-like noise fills the air. It's nothing natural, but more industrial. A high whining manufacturing alarm sound. It's very intense, very loud, and sounds very close by and scares the crap out of Mike. Doesn't make any sense. It sounds like something being projected through a giant loudspeaker, but they are miles from any kind of civilization. Mike has no idea why, but he finds himself hurrying toward the sound and ends up running right into Dave, who is sprinting up the trail toward him, also clearly in a panic. The trail is made of little round smooth rocks, making Dave stumble and fall as he scrambles his way towards Mike with a terrified look on his face, like he's just seen a ghost or something. And Dave is freaking. He doesn't exactly know why, but he just knows that something is horribly wrong. As he reaches Mike, Mike asks him, "Did you hear that sound?" Dave just replies, "What sound?" But before Mike can even respond, Dave yells, "There is something wrong with that kid," and grabs onto Mike's shirt like a scared little child. Mike thinks, "Wow, this is not the same Dave I met earlier today." Mike tries to get more information out of him. "What did you see? What do you mean there's something wrong with him?" But Dave won't say a word. Eventually, Mike gives up and they start walking back down the path. The two walk for only about a minute when they run into Ben. Ben is right at the edge of the lake, on his knees, hands by his side, staring up at the sky, and stone still, like he's frozen solid. And he's covered in what looks like white powder, like talcum powder or cement powder, from head to toe. His whole body, every inch, his hair, his face, his clothes, is completely covered in it. But there's none on the ground or anywhere around him. Mike and Dave both run to him. As they get closer, they see that even though his head is pointed up at the sky, Ben's eyes are actually closed, but his mouth is wide open in a muted scream at the sky. Mike grabs his shoulder with a little shake. "Ben, you okay, man?" Ben just crumples to the ground. Mike tells Dave, "Go get the girls now," and Dave runs off towards camp. Mike continues to do anything he can think of to get a response out of Ben when the siren goes off again, but this time it's like right behind him. At this point, Mike is freaking out. He's telling Ben, "Come on, buddy, get up. Come on, we gotta go now, get up." But Ben is still completely checked out. Mike tries to pick him up, but he's too heavy. He tries to get his arms around his waist to gain some leverage and get him on his feet, but that doesn't work. It's like he's just been turned off, just like a lifeless rag doll. Mike can't even hear him breathing. Now, Mike is in full-on panic mode. He doesn't know what to do. He stands there for a few agonizing minutes before Dave and the two girls finally come running down the path. Holly starts freaking out, completely hysterical, when again the siren goes off. Except this time, the two girls hear it too. Christy looks at Mike, horrified, and yells over the metallic blast, "What is that?" And Mike yells back, "I have no idea. Just help me with Ben." Unbelievably, Dave doesn't seem to hear the siren, and he's just standing there looking shell-shocked and completely disconnected. He starts to ramble incoherently about them, and he points over to a spot between the beach and the trees and says, "There." He says they stuck him. Mike doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. Who's they? Is he talking about some other campers around causing trouble? And at this moment, he can't really take the time to try to figure it out. He just focuses on the task at hand, which is not easy. Ben is, at first, stiff as a board. And then as they start to try to move him, he relaxes and then he just becomes floppy dead weight. But between all of them, they somehow eventually get Ben back to camp and put him on a picnic bench. Holly is in complete hysterics and keeps yelling, "What did you do to him?" And Mike yells back, "I didn't do anything." He looks at Dave, and Dave is just basically checked out. He is a vegetable. Mike then looks at Christy and notices that she's different. Her hair looks different. Different color, different length, and her clothes look different. Like old, like from another era old. But at least she's moving. Mike looks back to Ben, who looks like he took a face-first tumble into an ash heap and starts trying to wipe the stuff off, but it won't come off. Despite wrestling with him to get him back to camp, nobody has even a smudge of this stuff on them, and nobody knows what it is. And to make matters even worse, that storm that Mike saw building earlier is now sweeping over the area, and the sky is now black with clouds that open up and start pouring down rain. Everybody scrambles to pack up what they can, but pile into the truck, leaving most of their stuff behind. They start driving out of there. They drive through the main park and get to the main road where there are these giant garbage bins that the park has put there to make it easy for campers to dump their trash. Dave points at the bins and starts to open the car door to get out. Christy slams on the brakes so Dave doesn't just fall out of a moving car. He stumbles over to the bins and tosses what's left of the shrooms bag. He gets back in the car and just stares forward, completely blank, still completely checked out. They drive and drive and keep driving with everyone except Ben and Dave in complete DEFCON 5 hysterics until they reach Fort Bridger, which is so small, Mike doesn't even think it has a police department. Ben is now becoming less gray and more luminescent white, almost glowing. And every time Mike looks at him, he has to fight a new wave of panic. Dave, he's gone. The lights are on, but nobody's home. By the way he's acting, Mike wonders if he saw something by the lake, but maybe it was just so terrifying that he's just mentally turned himself off. They find a payphone and try to call for help, but can't figure out who to call. And the town itself is basically deserted. And while Mike and Christy and Holly are arguing with each other about what to do next, Dave sneaks off in the chaos, never to be seen again. Mike sees him slink off, but doesn't say anything. He has no idea where Dave is going, but is pretty sure that Dave has decided, in his catatonic state, to remove himself from the situation. So Mike just lets him go. The police and ambulance finally arrive about an hour later, and the EMTs pronounce Ben dead at the scene. By the time they get him out of the back of the Jeep, he looks perfectly normal. No white powder, no luminescence, like he's just quietly sleeping. The other three, however, sound like complete lunatics. The police take statements from all of them, and they eventually find the mushrooms that Dave had dumped in the trash bin. Mike and Holly don't get into any trouble, but Christy is convicted of distributing Class A drugs and is lucky to escape with 5 years of probation. But that is nothing compared to the mental punishment that all three of them continue to suffer. Because that's not the end. It gets even weirder. Nobody's experience of that day matches anybody else's. It's like they were on 3 different camping trips. Christy says that while Mike and Dave are looking for Ben, a group of really intense-looking Native Americans wander through the camp dressed in very poor, tatty, old tribal clothing. They walk right past her and Holly within a few feet, but don't make eye contact or even make any sound. Sounds nuts, but the Wind River Reservation, occupied primarily by the Shoshone and Arapaho Indians, is just 150 miles north, so maybe? The police take Christy back to the park later that day, and she showed them where Dave had dumped the mushrooms. However, Holly insists that it was only the 4 of them that went camping and that Dave was never there. She insists that it was she who brought the mushrooms and that it was she who got out of the Jeep and threw the drugs in the bin. She insists that they never pick anyone else up. Holly has zero recollection of fighting with anyone that day, so nobody was picking on Ben, and he just chose to go off by himself. Holly says that she sees a very tall old man dressed in dark clothing walking near the edge of the woods. When she makes eye contact, he pauses and waves to her before disappearing over the ridge. Mike and Christy never see anybody else there. However, Mike and Christy are adamant that Dave is there and both remember him being a total jerk. The police never find Dave and can't even confirm his existence. There are no phone records of any calls being placed to him, and South Salt Lake goes on for miles, so Mike can't remember where they picked him up. But Mike knows that this trip wasn't so bad that he hallucinated all this stuff. He stays present and grounded enough in reality the entire time that he knows what is real and what is not. However, he has no explanation for any of this. Later on, Mike hears that Ben's official cause of death is listed as unknown. He basically stopped living with no explanation that the coroner can find. And his toxicology report comes back clean. No drugs. Holly even insists that he never used any mushrooms, not that day or any other day. And no one recovers any gray dust or powder from his body. The police are at a total dead end and have no idea where to go with this case. So Mike wants to know, what is all of this? Is it just kids using shrooms and getting wrecked for being young and stupid? Is it an alien encounter? Or did they violate some kind of sacred Native American burial spot? What about that deafening siren in a place where there isn't any civilization, let alone industry, for miles? Did they anger a witch who lives nearby? Or did a parallel universe open up and allow them to experience another dimension? None of it makes any sense. The only thing that all 3 of them can agree on is that they all wish they had never gone camping on that summer day in 1992. Because even though no one can agree on what decisions were made and what actions were taken, they all have been sentenced to living with the outcome for the rest of their lives. Copalis Beach is a little tiny town right on the west coast of Washington State, just a couple of hours away from Seattle-Tacoma area. And John lives there with his family, his wife Sue, and his 2 boys, John Jr. and Timothy, who are 12 and 4 at this time, which is about the mid-60s. John works as a foreman in a roofing products mill in Aberdeen, Washington, which is just a few miles away from Copalis Beach. And that means he's responsible for all of the company's equipment and vehicles and the safety of all of the crews. So needless to say, people know him as a very serious man, not prone to making up stories. And one Monday morning in July, John is several hours late for work. Now, everybody knows something must be wrong because John always gets there early. He's the one who goes in and prepares the equipment and prepares the vehicles so that everything is ready for when the crews get there, they can just head on out to work. So when John does show up in the afternoon, looking pretty peaked, the boss asks him, "Are you okay?" And John says, "Yeah, but can we go in your office and talk for a minute?" Boss says, "Sure." They go into the office and sit down. John tells his boss, "Something destroyed my house this weekend." Now the boss is thinking somebody vandalized the house. So he asked him, "Well, do you know who it was?" John says this was not a person. I don't know what this was, but it destroyed my house. And the boss says, okay, wait a minute. Slow down, tell me what happened. And this is the story that John told. John said when he got home Friday night from work, his little boy Timmy came running up to him and told him that he saw a cowman in the field that afternoon. Now, John just thought he meant cowboy, because some of their neighbors would wear cowboy hats when they were working out in their fields. So he asked his son, was he wearing a cowboy hat? And Timmy said, no, he was a cowman, Daddy. He had fur and he was stinky, just like the cows. So John asked Sue, do you have any idea what he's talking about? And Sue said, not really. Apparently, Timmy had been out on the porch playing that afternoon. And he came running in to tell his mom, Mom, the cowman is stuck on the fence. And Sue doesn't know what he's talking about, but she decides to go check it out, follows him outside onto the porch. And as soon as she opens the door, she is hit in the face with this putrid, garbage, wet dog smell. And she looked around, didn't see anything out of the ordinary, except for where Timmy was pointing. She could see the top strand of the barbed wire was shaking back and forth, like somebody had pulled back on it and let it go. But she didn't see anything else. So she just told Timmy, you know what? Why don't you come and play inside the house for the rest of the afternoon? Not long after that, John Jr., who had been playing at a friend's house for the afternoon and who had walked home, got home and told his mom, somebody followed me home. And she says, what are you talking about? And John Jr. says, as I'm walking on the road, I could hear somebody next to me in the forest walking along with me. But they never came out of the woods, so I never saw them. But they sounded like they were really big because I could hear branches breaking and everything. But as soon as I got to the driveway, they stopped. And where the road meets the driveway on their property is roughly the same place where Timmy had seen the cowman. And John Jr. felt pretty spooked about the whole thing. So when his dad got home from work on Friday night, he asked if the two of them could go out into the woods and check it out a little bit. And John says, of course we can. After dinner, John straps on his .357 and the two boys head out to the field to see if they could find anything. And the first place they went was the place on the fence where Timmy said he saw the cowman that was stuck. And as they walked down the fence line, they didn't really see anything out of the ordinary until they came across a clump of hair tangled in the barbed wire. And John tried pulling it off, but it was really stuck. So he had to get out his buck knife and cut it out. And it was a pretty good chunk with what looked like a little chunk of flesh even stuck on one end. About 12 inches long of reddish brown, stringy, coarse hair. And the two boys looked at it and thought it kind of looked like the hair that would come out of a horse's tail or a horse's mane. Now, the space between the fence and where the forest line starts is about 10 feet wide. So the two boys climb through the fence and they start looking around on the ground, which is all grassy, and they're looking for hoof prints or footprints or anything that might tell them that a horse or anything else had been out there. But they don't find anything. So they decided to keep going. And they enter the woods through a known game trail that they know deer use quite a bit. And it's like 8 o'clock at night at this point. So it's kind of dark outside, but it's pretty dark in the woods. And they walk for a little bit until they smell that garbage, wet dog smell that their mom had talked about. And at that point, John says he felt like they were being watched. And the hair on the back of his neck stands up. And he turned to John Jr. and says, you know, maybe we should head back before it gets too dark. And John Jr. certainly didn't argue. So the pair turned around and started to walk back out of the woods. And as they were, they could hear footsteps on their left walking with them. They stopped. The footsteps stopped. But they kept walking until they were almost at the clearing. And at that point, John leans down to his son and whispers in his ear, on the count of 3, I want you to run like hell to the house. John Jr. nodded, and John whispers, 1, 2, 3. He gives his son a push in the back to get him on his way, at the same time turning around 180 and heading back into the woods toward the sound. And as he's running, he pulls his gun and veers off the trail into the underbrush. Now, the underbrush is full of bushes and ferns, so it slows him down quite a bit. But he can hear whoever it is heading deeper into the woods in front of him. John says he's thinking he's dealing with a vagrant who's maybe camped out in the woods, maybe scoping out the neighborhood houses to see who he can rob at night. And John is a pretty big dude who can handle himself in just about any situation, and he's got a big gun. So he's really not worried about confronting a vagrant in the woods. So he stops to listen, and he hears whoever it is stop as well, just a little bit in front of him. And as he's looking in that direction, he can see a little bit of movement right behind a tree, like somebody's trying to hide behind it. So he levels his gun and says, "Come on out, nice and slow, or I swear to God I will come in there and shoot you." And everything was quiet for a few seconds, until he thought he saw some movement out of the corner of his eye. So he spun around to get a better look, and he could see something moving through the dense ferns. But with all the foliage, he couldn't really get a good look at it. But it was moving away from him very quietly on 4 legs, and he was only like 15 feet away from him. He thought it was a bear, until he saw a huge, hairy arm with a human-like hand reach out from the brush, grab a tree, and use that tree to pull itself upright out of the brush, stood up on 2 legs, and turned to glare at John. It was enormous, over 7 feet tall, and at least 3 to 4 feet wide at the chest. Now, it was too late in the evening for John to really make out many of the features, but he said it looked like it had 2 glowing red eyes, and he could see its teeth, like maybe it was curling its lips back in a snarl. And the 2 of them just stood there, staring at one another for a few tense moments, until in a flash, the beast pushed off that tree he'd been holding onto, which was about 4 inches in diameter, and it snapped right in half with the force. He had pushed himself off to propel himself in the other direction, where John says he disappeared into the undergrowth in a flash, but sounding like a bulldozer. And John just stood there in complete shock, until he realized the direction that the beast was traveling was the same direction that his son was traveling. So he snaps out of his paralysis and runs to hit the trail, because he knows he can run faster on the trail. And he is hoping to get out of the woods as fast as he can and hopefully head off this creature before it could get to his son. And the whole time he's running, he can hear this thing flashing through the woods not far from him. And as he hits that clearing, he scans around looking for his son. And John Jr. is there, just on the other side of the fence where he's waiting for his dad. And John screamed at him, "Run to the house!" as he looks over and he sees this thing come out of the woods about 50 feet to his left. And this thing crossed that 10 feet between the woods and the fence and went over the fence in 2 strides and was running parallel with John Jr. in a matter of seconds. And John stopped and pulled his gun and aimed it at the creature, but he couldn't fire because John Jr. and the house were in the line of fire. So John vaults the fence and he's running toward his son, who he knows is never going to be able to make it to the gate before this thing runs into him. So he fires a shot at the ground, hoping that maybe he can just scare this thing off. But instead, this thing speeds up and alters its course to a collision course with John Jr. And as John is running toward them, he hears John Jr. scream as he sees the creature dip his shoulder down, and the next thing he saw was John Jr. flying through the air about 10 feet and hitting the ground rolling. The creature didn't stop running. It kept running and it looped its way back until it was running back toward the woods. And as soon as the line of fire was clear, John let off 5 rounds into that creature. He's pretty sure they all went wild because the creature never stopped and the creature didn't make any noise. It just kept going until it disappeared into the woods. So John goes running to John Jr. and helps him get up off the ground. And John Jr. is a little shaky and he asks his dad, Was that a bear? John Jr. had been so busy running, he didn't even see what it was that was chasing him. He just said something big and black suddenly ran into him. He felt a paw on his butt, and he was airborne. So as soon as John knew that John Jr. was okay, the two of them ran through the gate into the house, shut the door behind him, and locked it. And immediately, Sue comes running in, wanting to know why there are shots being fired in her yard and what is going on. And as soon as John could breathe again, he told her to go lock the back door. He's calling the sheriff. This is before the days of 911. So John picks up the phone and starts dialing the number to the sheriff's department. And as it's ringing, he's thinking to himself, what am I going to say? Because he realizes what an idiot he's going to sound like to the sheriff when he tells the sheriff he just got chased out of the woods by the boogeyman. And he just told Sue it was a large animal, because he did not know how to tell her that Tim's cowman was indeed real and far more terrifying than they could have imagined. And he just told everybody to keep the doors locked and stay away from the windows. By around 10 o'clock, both boys were in bed, and John and Sue sat down to watch the 10 o'clock news. And soon they started to hear this moaning cry, almost like the siren for the volunteer fire department. And it would end with this whoop whoop, and it was coming from the woods opposite the house. And Sue says, what the hell is that? And John says, that's Tim's cowman. John breaks down and tells Sue exactly what happened to him and John Jr. in the woods. And Sue gets hysterical and wants to call the sheriff. And John says, you can't do that. They're gonna think we're nuts. I will handle this. And she says, well, you better. And I don't want either of the boys playing outside until whatever that thing is, it's gone. And the howling went on until about midnight. And John wanted to stay up and watch the house, but the day's events had just totally wore him out. So he went to bed probably about 1 a.m. and the rest of the night was totally uneventful. The next day is Saturday, and everybody slept in. By the time John and Sue got out of bed, both boys were sitting in front of the TV, eating cereal out of their bowls, and watching Saturday morning cartoons. And John Jr. tells his dad, I heard the bear rubbing up against the house last night, but I was too scared to get up and tell you. And Timmy says, the cowman talks funny. And John stops cold. When did you talk to the cowman? And Timmy says, last night, in my room. John says, the cowman was in your room? And Timmy says, no, Daddy, the cowman is too big for my room. He was talking at me through the window, and goes back to watching his cartoons. And John asks, what did the cowman say, Tim? And Tim says, he talks funny. I don't know what he said, but he sounded like, ooh, ooh, ah, ah. And John, breaking out in a cold sweat, asked Timmy, did the cowman try to get in your window? And Timmy says, no, he's too big for that. He just made funny faces. He has Lincoln log teeth. And John later found out that by Lincoln log teeth, what Timmy meant was that the creature had square teeth that were about as big as the smallest pieces in a Lincoln log building set. Apparently, it actually spent quite a while talking and making funny faces outside of Timmy's window. Timmy said it went to sleep outside of his window and that he could hear it snoring. So John slowly goes into Timmy's room and carefully looks out the window. No sleeping cowman. John tells the boys to get dressed because they are all going to visit John's brother, Bob. So once John got Sue and the boys packed into the car and off they went to go see their Uncle Bob for the day, John calls one of his crew members, Patrick, and asks him to come over. He figured they'd have most of the day to look for this thing. So when Patrick got there, John asked him, you ready to go hunting? And Patrick says, I don't poach, and I don't want to know if you do. John says, we're not hunting deer, and tells Patrick about what happened the night before. And Patrick really didn't believe him, but he could see how sincere John was and that he was still kind of shaken up. John had his pistol and a bolt-action .30-06, and Patrick had a .38 in his truck, and John loaned him a 12-gauge shotgun. And the first thing they did was circle the house to see if they could see any signs that it had been there during the night. Now, in the back of the house, there is a faucet outside that leaks, so there's continually a big mud puddle around it. And as John and Patrick came to the back of the house, they could see that in that mud puddle was a footprint. And John says it was a perfect human footprint, except that it was 18 inches long and very wide, and it looked like it had been put there on purpose, more like a calling card than an animal track. And next to the track were 4 straight lines in the mud about 8 inches long, and it looked like somebody had raked their fingers through the mud, and they couldn't quite figure out what that was all about until they turned the corner to the side of the house where Timmy's bedroom window is. Above the window, about 7 feet up, were 4 muddy streaks, as well as a bunch of muddy fingerprints all over the window. The glass wasn't cracked or broken, just smeared with mud. By this time, Patrick is starting to believe that something weird did happen on John's property the night before. So the 2 men decide it's time to hit the woods and see if they can find this thing. And as they're walking out there, John decides he's going to feed the pigs. Why not? He's right there. They have 2 pigs. They're small. They're only about 40 pounds apiece. And the pig pen is behind the barn, which is about 100 yards from the house. Now, usually when the pigs hear John coming, they know he's going to feed them and they start squealing. And John, as they're walking out there, notices he doesn't hear anything. Nothing. And as they round the barn to look at the pen is empty. No damage or signs of a struggle. The pigs are just gone, and John decides it's time to go kill this thing. So John and Patrick enter the woods on the same game trail that John and John Jr. had the night before. And John pointed out to Patrick all of the broken trees, and they actually did find some prints on the ground in the woods. And then spent the rest of the day poking around looking for something and couldn't find anything. And just before dark that night, Sue and the kids come driving up. So he said, "You know what, Patrick? Why don't you just go home? Nothing's going to happen here anyway." And Patrick said, "All right, man." And he drove off, leaving John watching the woods. Now, Sue brought John out a plate of food, a Coleman lantern, and a flashlight. And John said he was going to stay there and watch the house for the whole night. But before anybody went to bed, he helped Sue push their king-size bed against the wall opposite the windows in their bedroom. And they had agreed that Sue and the 2 boys would all sleep in that bedroom that night. Now, Sue had grown up in a hunting family, so she knew guns just as well as John did, and convinced him to let her keep the 12 gauge with her and the boys in the room. So John finally gives in and lets her keep the shotgun in the room on one condition. And that is, before she shoots, she has to ask for a name. And if it says John, don't shoot. Now, there was a full moon that night, and it shone down into the fields and shed pretty good light on to the field until you got to the shadows of the woodline. And the night air was full of the sound of thousands of crickets and of bullfrogs in the pond that they had behind the house. And as the moon rose higher in the sky through the night, the shadows on the ground started to shift, and John could swear he saw movement in many different places. In his mind, each one of those was a big, hairy creature. He stands up and lights a cigarette. He's trying to shake the fear so he can just concentrate on the task at hand. And as he's smoking, he wanders over to one end of the porch and finds himself staring into the open barn doors that are all shadow dark. But something was different, and he couldn't quite place it. In the front of the barn was open facing the house, but the moon was hitting it on the side, making it too dark to see inside the barn. So he just stood watching that black opening, finishing his smoke and thinking about his missing pigs. And that's when he realized what was wrong. There were no more crickets and frogs. Everything had gone dead silent. The only thing he could hear was the buzzing of his own nervous system. And when he turned to walk back to his chair, he thought he saw some movement in the barn, and he looked at the opening of the barn and couldn't see anything. And then as he looked to the side just a little bit, he thought he could see two red glowing eyes about 8 feet off the ground. He couldn't see them if he looked straight on, only if he looked to the side a little bit. They were a deep, burning coal red, almost invisible in the dark. Every few seconds, they would disappear when the creature blinked, and John's heart started to thud in his chest as he waited for this thing to leave the barn and start coming toward the house. And he slowly backed up toward his chair, never looking away, and picked up his .30-06. He then walked back to the end of the porch and watched and waited. And he stared at those red eyes for what seems like hours until they blinked out and didn't come back. And he watched intently for a few more minutes. They didn't come back, and he didn't see any movement. So he thinks for a second, and he picks up his flashlight and turns it on. But the flashlight is too weak to penetrate the darkness all the way into the barn. He has to get closer. And he wasn't real excited about the idea of leaving the relative safety of the porch to go confront a red-eyed monster in his barn. But as he puts it, I'll be damned if I'm going to live in fear in my own house. So he slowly steps off the porch with his gun and his flashlight, making his way toward the barn, kind of plucking up his courage as he goes. As he got closer, he still couldn't see any movement. Whatever it was, it had moved deeper to the back of the barn. And as he gets to about 20 feet from the entrance, he turns on that feeble flashlight again and starts looking around the barn, seeing a tractor, an old pickup, a bunch of boxes and buckets, lots of places for something to hide, even something big. And he stops at the entrance to the barn and uses the flashlight to check every corner and under the vehicles. And he steps into the barn, every sense straining to hear some movement or see some movement. And nothing. So he walks around the pickup truck, just waiting for a big hairy arm to come out and grab him. But he made his way all the way to the back of the barn without seeing anything. So he turns around to leave the barn, both relieved at the fact that he didn't encounter a monster, and also very perplexed and scared at the idea of where did it go? And as he's walking out, he glances to the side at the wide staircase leading up to the hayloft. In that moment, every fiber of his being knows that whatever this is up in that hayloft, waiting for him to walk out so it can jump down on him. And he is paralyzed with fear. And he swears he can hear the boards above him creaking under some enormous weight, moving itself to the edge and waiting for him to come out from underneath. So he just stood there with his heart pounding in his ears, not sure what to do next, when boom! He hears an explosion of the shotgun come from the house, followed by the screaming of his wife. And his paralysis broke, and he ran to the house, totally forgetting what might have been up in the hayloft. And he is sprinting to the house, and he hits the porch, and he hits the front door so hard he just about knocks it down, and runs through the house into the hallway where the bedrooms are. And he opens up the door to his bedroom to see his wife standing there, holding the shotgun, pointing out the window, and his boys huddled up crying on the bed. And as he bursts through that door, Sue swings around with the gun, and John hits the deck, waiting for the shot, but it doesn't come. And he looks up and sees Sue put the gun down and go to the bed to comfort her boys. And he asks Sue what happened, and Sue was just shaking, and she couldn't even answer him. Timmy started crying, "Why did you shoot the cowman, Mommy? Why?" And John Jr. just buried his face into Sue's shoulder and just cried. So John gave everybody a few minutes to just calm down and then told them, "Follow me." And he led them through the house out onto the porch. He looked around, didn't see anything. Everything was quiet again. And he told them, "Get in the car." And everybody filed out into the car, still wearing their pajamas. Once everyone was safely in the car, John joined them. And they left the house and headed to his brother's house. And on their way there, Sue calmed down enough to tell John what had happened. And she said a couple of hours after the boys went to sleep, she finally dozed off. Until she woke up to Tim talking to somebody and this weird chirping, chattering sound. And she saw that Tim wasn't in the bed. He was standing in front of one of the windows. And that moonlight was shining in the windows and was doing a pretty good job of illuminating the room. Except the window that Timmy was standing in front of had a big shadow in front of it, like a big tree was there. But Sue knew that there were no trees that big, that close to the house. So she whispered to Tim, "Get away from the window." And Timmy says, "Listen, Mom, the cowman can sound like a bird." And Sue said, trying to keep her voice quiet, "Tim, get away from the window." And right after she spoke, the noises changed. It changed from that chirping, chattering to more like gibberish, almost human-like speech with a couple of pig snorts thrown in. And at this point, John Jr. wakes up and he says, "What is that?" Which seemed to incite the creature, who started pounding on the outside of the walls hard enough to make the wall shake. That made John start to scream. And Timmy yells, "Be quiet! You're gonna scare him away!" Sue yells at Timmy again, "Get away from the window!" as she turns around and grabs the gun. And as she gets out of bed and starts going toward Timmy, the creature leans in the window and looks right at her. And she screamed and pointed the gun at it, but she was afraid to shoot because Timmy was in the way. So she started to move forward to grab Tim when there's an explosion of glass and a big hairy arm reaches in through the window toward Timmy. And Sue screams again and shoots above Timmy's head, blowing out the window and hitting the creature with double-aught buckshot. And it jerked backwards out of the window and disappeared into the darkness. And a few seconds later, she heard it screaming on its way to the woods. It was trying to get Tim. It was trying to get my baby. And Sue started crying. And John did his best to comfort her as they drove to Bob's house. So John and his family stayed that night and the next night at his brother Bob's house. And he told his brother what had happened and could tell that Bob really didn't believe him. And Bob agreed to go with John back to the house Monday morning before work, because in their rush to leave, John had left the front door wide open, and he was afraid that wild animals or vandals could get into the house. And when they got to the house, it looked like a tornado had hit the inside. The couch was upside down. Their 200-pound TV console was on the other end of the room in a pool of broken glass. And Bob even pointed out cracks in the plaster in the ceiling above where it looked like something had hit its head. And the kitchen was totally trashed. The refrigerator was lying on its side and there was food everywhere. And as the two men made their way down the hallway, they could see that the doors were still closed to the boys' rooms. They were left untouched, as well as the bathroom. But the master bedroom was also a disaster. Pillows ripped up and feathers everywhere. A chest of drawers that they had was knocked over. A big mirror they had on the wall was all smashed. Bob just looked around and said, "You better call the police." And John says, "And tell them what? Bigfoot destroyed my house?" So the two men just leave the house. And as they're walking out, John closes the door behind him this time. And he feels a little pang of sadness because he knows his family is never going to live in this house again. Because he also knows that there's no way he is going to let that monster get that close to his family ever again. Trish is in love. But that's the problem. She and Jeff have been together on and off since they were in high school. And as they got older and actually started adulting, things got more stable and they were on more than they were off. And that's just kind of where they stayed for the first half of their 20s. The problem part is that Trish and Jeff are that couple that everybody knows shouldn't be together, but nobody can help but watch the train wreck as it's happening. Trish and Jeff love each other. They're just not good for each other. But like a moth to the flame, no matter what happens, they return to each other over and over again. Of course, the fact that their two families are like family to each other doesn't help matters. Trish is really close to her mom, so every time she comes to her for advice, her mom, thinking that with age comes wisdom and that Trish is short on both, tells her that not all relationships come easy and that sometimes you have to put in some work, maybe go get some counseling. And it's not that her mom is blind to the toxicity between the two of them, but she has seen how good they can be together. And they're both such great people, and she believes that they can both rise above their issues and be happy together. Now, eventually, Trish decides this is all just too much, and she just needs to end this relationship. And it's not pretty. They don't go to fisticuffs or anything like that with each other. There's no abuse, but there's so much anger and resentment that has built up between the two of them that when the proverbial straw breaks the proverbial camel's back, much to the dismay of not only them but their families, it goes down hard. Now, Trish's mom keeps telling her to take whatever me time she needs, but don't shut the door on this relationship. She says, I know if you guys work hard, you can save it. And Trish is thinking, whose side are you on? She just felt not heard and betrayed by her own mother. She can't believe her own mother is siding with Jeff. And that she can't see how much Jeff has hurt her, how dysfunctional their relationship has become, and that it's no longer good for either of them. She feels bad because she knows her mom likes Jeff so much, but she's her daughter. So Trish stops talking to her. So mother and daughter don't speak for a good couple of months, but that all changes one day when Trish's sister calls and says, hey, just thought you might want to know, Mom's really sick, like terminal sick. Now, Trish has been working really hard to put her relationship with Jeff behind her. She hasn't talked to him, she's blocked his number, she's blocked him on every social media platform she can think of, and instead spends the next year and a half channeling all of her energy into her mother and making sure that her mother is okay, or as okay as she can be. As the end is nearing, Trish tries to treat every day as a gift and soak in every memory before it's too late. So unfortunately, Trish's mom passes away. And just like everyone does when someone we love passes away, we play the what if game, and Trish is no different. She keeps asking herself, what if I hadn't stopped talking to her? Was she so worried about me that it made her sick? Did she know I was just frustrated with her for not backing me up? Did she know how much I loved her? And of course, anger is a normal part of the grieving process. But Trish isn't angry with her mother. She's angry with Jeff. If things with Jeff hadn't gone down the way that they did, things wouldn't have been the way that they were between her and her mother. It's Jeff's fault she lost those 6 months not talking to her mom that she now desperately wants back. But a moth will always go back to the flame. So Trish would be angry with him, but then the switch would flip and she would find herself wanting to call him, to tell him about her mom, knowing that her mom would want him to know. Not sure if she had drawn her lines so well, if Jeff had even heard the news. But she decided, nope, I drew this line. It's not really fair to either of us for me to change the rules now. She hasn't spoken to him in over 2 years at this point, and she feels like if she opens that Pandora's box, who knows what old wounds are going to open up again. Let what is buried stay buried. It's time for her to move on and go find happiness for herself. A couple of years go by with Trish missing her mom every day. And she notices that whenever she needs her the most, she has a dream where her mom visits her and tells her exactly the thing she needs to hear. She's always been a pretty spiritual person, but now she starts believing in signs and dreams, feeling as though her mother is truly communicating with her. And it gets to the point where anytime Trish feels like she needs advice from her mom, she says a prayer before bed, asking for her mom's help. And more often than not, she gets a response. As the years go by, the memory of Jeff is fading. The anger towards him is fading. In fact, she doesn't think of him much at all anymore. Until one day, 4 years since the last time they talked, he pops into her head. And this time it's different. She doesn't feel the weight on her shoulders or the ache in her heart anymore. She feels forgiveness. She feels kindness. She actually starts remembering the good times without the shadow of the bad. She doesn't want him back again. That ship has sailed. She has zero trouble now that she has some time and some distance admitting that they were toxic together, but she can also admit that sometimes they were also pretty good together. And with the wisdom of a few more years under her belt, she can now understand why her mom was so insistent that they get therapy, get counseling, work through it. It's not that her mom was minimizing the bad, but that she believed in the good. And that realization makes her miss her mom that much more. But Trish has closed that chapter. A couple more years go by, and it's about 6 years since she's spoken with Jeff. And in the time she's been away from him and has been without her mom, she finally starts to get a sense of who she is. For so long, she felt like her life was someone else's plan. But now that everything has slowed down and she only has herself to think about, she finally figures out what she wants. She wants a quiet, peaceful life. So she moves into a new place, a tiny little house just a little out of town, surrounded by forests and creeks and farmland. This is the life she always dreamed of. Now here is where things start to get interesting. About 6 months after moving into her new home, she gets a text message from some random number. And this text message claims to be Jeff reaching out. Trish decides not to answer that text. In fact, she's a little perturbed because since they broke up, she's gotten a new number. Obviously he has two since she doesn't recognize the one she's looking at. But how did he get it? And that is not the last message. Over the next couple of weeks, she receives several more apologetic messages from Jeff. Messages that don't even really sound like Jeff. Then again, it's been over 6 years since she talked to him, so a person can change quite a bit in 6 years. She doesn't put a whole lot of thought into it. She's just happy for him that he obviously is making some of his own soul-searching progress. And the messages he's sending are unbelievable. He's apologizing for every toxic behavior that he has displayed during their relationship. He's atoning for things that are very specific, things that only he and her would know. The kind of dirty laundry that no couple airs to anyone. And he's telling her that she's the most beautiful, incredible, wonderful woman that he's ever met. And he wishes he could have been better for her, that they could have been better together. But now, all he wants is for her to be happy and safe. And he even tells her, "I'm sorry about your mom, but she's always watching over you." That particular message shocks her a bit because she hasn't spoken to anybody who knows him who might turn around and tell him. And she certainly didn't tell him. But again, she just assumes that the gossip grapevine has longer vines than she can even guess. One evening, Trish is at home, a place she's always felt is her safe space. But this night is different. She feels restless. She's jumpy and paranoid, and every little sound, every little thing is making her internal alarms go off. She can't figure out why. Deciding she just needs to try and chillax a little bit, she puts on a rom-com, grabs a glass of wine, puts her phone on Do Not Disturb, and tries to relax this feeling out of her body. That's when her phone dings, even though she just put it on Do Not Disturb. Just a little freaked, she looks over, and it's a text from the supposed Jeff number again. When she opens the message, all it says is, "I love you, but I have to go. But I need you to know whatever you do, do not answer your door tonight." And then another message comes in that says, "I'm sorry to say that this is my last message to you. Just know that I will always be there for you. And please never doubt how much I loved you." Now at this point, Trish is really kind of disappointed. She had been so happy for Jeff because it seemed like he'd had this major epiphany in his life that was leading him down a positive path. But these last two messages just hit her like this is some kind of major manipulation on his part, that he's just trying to get a reaction out of her because she hasn't responded to anything else so far. So with more than just a little bit of sadness, she decides to just delete the number, block it, and move on with her life. The last thing she wants at this point is to let him back into her head again. Now, Trish doesn't know if it's because of the text messages or if the messages are just adding to the problem, but she still has this weight in her chest, this ominous feeling of dread. But she puts her phone down and continues on with her movie. After it's over, she collects her wet tissues, downs the last bit of wine in her glass, and gets ready to go to bed. She shuts off the TV, shuts off the lights, and starts walking down the hall to her bedroom when she hears bang, bang, bang on her front door. She stops dead. She can hear her heart pounding, and even though she's trying to breathe as quietly as possible, she can hear the wind rushing in and out of her lungs, and she's just listening. A few seconds of quiet and bang, bang, bang on the door. Trish's mind is racing. She's thinking, who the hell could be at my door at this hour? Is it Jeff? Has he lost his mind? How could he even know where I live? How did he know someone was going to come to the door unless it's him? But then why would he tell me not to answer it? She decides not to answer it and starts walking toward her room again when she hears bang, 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 and then a voice. It's not Jeff's.
Can we come in?
Fear and confusion wash over her at the same time because not only is that voice not Jeff's voice, but it's a child's voice. Now, she hasn't lived there very long, but she has yet to see any kids around where she lives. Her whole neighborhood is full of recent empty nesters who are too young for grandchildren. So she slowly creeps her way towards a window that looks out toward the front door. All the lights are off, so they shouldn't be able to see her. Trish peeks out the window to see two children staring at the door, standing almost perfectly still. She hears,
We know you're in there. Let us in.
She decides she needs to get a better look to see if there's some chance that she might know these kids or at least see what they're doing. So she walks toward the window next to the door and takes another peek. She wishes she hadn't. As soon as she's at the closer window and can see the two kids again, their faces, perfectly in sync like robots, turn directly towards her and stare. She can see immediately that they have very pale skin, very dark hair, and what looks like completely blacked out, soulless eyes. One of the kids says to her,
We can see you're in there. Did he tell you not to let us in?
Trish is terrified and feels like she's in some kind of horror movie. She runs to the kitchen, grabs her phone, and dials 911. The police do show up, but of course, there's no one around anymore. No kids, and the ground is all dewy grass and mud, but no footprints. So the cops are kind of thinking, what has she been smoking? Trish tries to explain everything about Jeff and the messages that he's been sending her and how he told her someone was going to come to the door. The cops ask to see the messages, but she can't show them because she deleted them and blocked the number. The police ask, well, it sounds like things didn't end too well with the two of you. Is there any chance he figured out where you live and is just messing with you? She tells them no, partly because she can't see how he would be able to figure out where she is, and partly because she just can't believe that he would be that vindictive. He's had 6 years to get back at her if he wanted to. Why start now? So the officers try to reassure her and tell her it's probably just a coincidence and some stupid kids. Everything seems fine now, but call us again if you need us. And they leave. Needless to say, Trish has a really hard time falling asleep. But when she finally does, she dreams about her mom. Her mom says, "I know what you thought of him, but he saved you tonight." When she wakes up, she knows she should feel good about the visit from her mom, but she can't. Instead, she's angry because when she went to bed, she felt like Jeff was just messing with her again, playing with her head in his toxic, manipulative way. So this dream of her mother siding with Jeff again just sent her into that same spiral of insecurity that she'd had while her mother was still alive. But she vows to forget about the entire last 24 hours. Weeks go by, and she doesn't know whether Jeff has tried to text her anymore because she blocked his number, but she still can't shake the memory of that night. She can't let it go. So, against her better judgment, she finally decides to reach out to Jeff's sister. Trish and his sister were never very close because his sister was none too quiet about the fact that she thought their relationship was toxic and never wanted them to be together. But she was the most neutral person that Trish could think of to reach out to. She reaches out to her on social media, kind of explains everything that's been going on, and asks her, "So do you have any idea why he's texting me? What does he want? And how did he know these kids were going to show up at my door?" The response she receives is certainly not the response she expects. What she gets is a very angry word lashing, full of capital letters and exclamation points. Something to the effect of, "Stop messing with me. This isn't funny. This is going too far. And a few other choice tidbits I will leave to your imagination." Trish is a little shocked and really confused, so she kind of nervously replies to her and asks, "What are you talking about?" Jeff's sister tells Trish, "Jeff's dead. He died a couple of years ago. So if somebody is texting you, it ain't him." Trish's world spins, and all she can think about is that dream she had of her mother saying Jeff had saved her. She goes into her phone and opens up her list of blocked phone numbers, and that phone number isn't there. So she either never blocked the number, so it wasn't in her blocked list, or it somehow disappeared from the blocked list, or it never existed. But she could swear that she blocked that number, didn't she? The black-eyed children never returned, but she knows to her core that she saw those kids at her door. She knows she heard them say,
Did he tell you not to let us in?
and now she really can't let it go. So she starts digging in and researching, and she learns about black-eyed kids and the fact that plenty of people have seen them, but nobody knows what they are or where they come from. As for Trish, she believes that all of these apologetic messages were from Jeff, making peace with her from the other side, and that her mom was right. He had saved her, but from what, no one knows. Isn't it amazing how stories can touch us in so many different ways? From heart-pounding terror to moments that restore your faith in everything. Each one of these encounters has left its mark, not just on those who lived them, but on all of us who hear them. If you'd like to see the full episodes where these stories came from, I have linked them all in the description below. Be careful out there, and I will see you here again on The In-Between.